You don't belong here. This is first class, not some charity seat. Patricia Whitfield's voice cut through the cabin like shattering glass, her manicured finger pointing accusingly at the teenage boy seated by the window in 2A. Flight 847 to San Francisco hadn't even taken off yet. The Atlantic Airways first-class cabin fell silent as heads turned toward the commotion. The boy, dressed in a worn gray hoodie and faded jeans, didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, his calm expression a stark contrast to Patricia's growing agitation. "Did you hear me?" Patricia stepped closer, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor. "Security should handle this before we're all stuck up here with—" She gestured dismissively at the teenager who still hadn't moved or responded. Gabriela Mendez, the lead flight attendant, approached with practiced caution. 8 years with Atlantic Airways had taught her that first-class confrontations required delicate handling, especially when they involved passengers like Patricia Whitfield, whose platinum loyalty card and weekly business flights made her a recognized regular. "Ma'am, is there a problem I can assist with?" Gabriela asked, positioning herself slightly between Patricia and the boy. "Yes, there is." Patricia's voice carried the sharp authority of someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms. "This person is clearly in the wrong section." She emphasized person with a subtle sneer. "I fly first class twice weekly, and I know when someone is in the wrong place." The boy finally looked up, his dark eyes revealing nothing as he quietly returned to the book in his hands. His lack of reaction seemed to further irritate Patricia, who pulled out her phone and began tapping the screen. "Good morning, everyone," she announced, to no one in particular. "Patricia here, and you won't believe what I'm dealing with on today's flight." She was broadcasting live on Instagram, her camera sweeping briefly toward the boy before returning to her own face. "I travel first class for business constantly." Patricia continued, her voice taking on the practiced tone of social media expertise. "And I can tell when someone clearly doesn't belong." Her viewer count began to climb 50, then 100, then more. Captain Thomas Blackwell's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay. Departure is pushed back approximately 10 minutes while we resolve a passenger seating issue." Patricia's eyes lit up at this announcement, taking it as validation. She aimed her phone camera toward the boy again, who remained absorbed in his reading material, seemingly unaware of or deliberately ignoring the drama unfolding around him. Other passengers were reacting in various ways. An elderly couple exchanged whispers, nodding slightly in agreement with Patricia. A young Hispanic mother across the aisle watched with growing disapproval, instinctively pulling her infant son closer. A businessman in an expensive suit glanced up from his laptop, initially annoyed by the disturbance, then interested in the unfolding drama. Ma'am Gabriela approached again, her professionalism intact despite her discomfort. "Perhaps we could discuss your concern privately." "There's nothing to discuss privately," Patricia replied, still recording. "That young man is obviously in the wrong seat. I need to see his boarding pass. I can't ask passengers to show their boarding passes to other passengers," Gabriela explained carefully. Patricia laughed, a sharp sound without humor. "Then you check it, because I guarantee he's supposed to be in economy. Just look at him." The boy was indeed an unlikely figure in first class. His sneakers were worn, his jeans had obviously seen better days, and his hoodie bore the logo of a local public high school. Nothing about his appearance suggested someone who could afford the 4-figure price tag of a first-class ticket. Gabriela turned toward the boy. "Sir, could I please see your boarding pass?" The young man looked up, his expression calm and measured. "Of course." His voice was surprisingly deep and steady for someone who appeared to be around 16. He reached into an inner pocket of his jacket, not his hoodie, but a simple black jacket underneath that Gabriela hadn't noticed before, and produced his boarding pass. The paper was different, heavier stock, platinum-colored instead of the standard blue. Gabriela glanced at it, her eyebrows rising slightly before her professional mask returned. "Thank you, sir. Everything appears to be in order." Patricia's face flushed. Let me see it. Ma'am, I cannot share another passenger's boarding information. This is ridiculous. Patricia's voice rose, and her Instagram audience was eating it up. Comments flooded in, mostly supportive. Stand your ground, Patricia. You're protecting everyone. Don't back down. The viewer count hit 300 as Patricia continued her broadcast. The young man remained silent, though his hand occasionally touched something in his jacket pocket, as if reassuring himself it was still there. I'm not trying to be difficult, Patricia announced to her growing audience, but airline security is everyone's responsibility, especially after everything that's happened in recent years. The implication hung in the air like smoke. The boy finally spoke, addressing Patricia directly. Ma'am, I understand your concern about safety, but I assure you I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. Something in his tone made Gabriella look at him more carefully. There was an authority there, a weight that seemed odd coming from someone so young. Patricia wasn't having it. Look, kid, I don't know how you got that boarding pass, but Flight 847 departure, now delayed 15 minutes, came the announcement. We apologize for the inconvenience. Patricia smiled triumphantly at her phone. See, they're taking this seriously. What she didn't know was that the delay had nothing to do with the boy's presence in first class. The captain had been making calls checking passenger manifests, confirming something that would soon change everything. The boy's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and for just a moment something flickered across his face. Not worry exactly, more like anticipation. He typed back quickly, then slipped the phone into his jacket pocket, the same pocket where he kept something else. Something he hadn't shown to anyone yet. Elijah Reynolds kept his breathing steady as the woman continued her tirade. Inside, a hurricane of emotions threatened his carefully constructed calm, but years of his father's training held firm. Never let them see you sweat, William Reynolds Jr. had taught him since he was old enough to understand words. Your dignity isn't negotiable. Patricia Whitfield wasn't the first person to decide he didn't belong somewhere, and Elijah knew she wouldn't be the last. At 12, he'd been followed by security at an upscale department store while shopping for his mother's birthday gift. At 14, a restaurant host had asked if he was there to pick up a takeout order when he arrived for a reservation. Just 2 months ago, a teacher at his new private school had mistaken him for a scholarship student rather than a full-paying enrollee. Each time the same calm response. Each time the same dignified reaction. His father's voice echoed in his mind. They expect anger. They're comfortable with anger. What they don't expect is composure. His fingers traced the edges of his grandfather's leather portfolio in his pocket. William Reynolds, Sr. had carried it through his service as a Tuskegee Airman, one of the first black military aviators in the U.S. Armed Forces. The portfolio had held flight logs, mission briefings, and later, after the war, his business plans for what would eventually become Atlantic Airways. Now it held the documents that would change this encounter completely, but Elijah wasn't ready to reveal them. Not yet. The text message from Elena Vasquez, his father's chief of staff, had confirmed what he suspected word of the incident was already reaching corporate headquarters. PR monitoring social media mentions. Security protocols activated. Your call on timing. Elijah had replied simply, 10 more minutes. Let it develop. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger, something his father had prepared him for. Sometimes William Jr. had told him the most powerful teaching moments require patience. Through his window, Elijah could see ground crews preparing the aircraft. His flight was supposed to be routine, a quick trip to San Francisco to meet with developers for the airline's new mobile app before visiting his father in the hospital. William Reynolds Jr. had suffered a stroke 3 weeks ago, and while his condition had stabilized, the doctors had insisted on a medical leave from his duties as CEO. The board's emergency appointment of Elijah as interim operational head had been controversial, but his father had been preparing him for this role since childhood. As Patricia's voice grew louder, Elijah noticed more passengers recording the incident. Good. Witnesses were important. Documentation was crucial. His father had taught him that too. Evidence matters more than emotion, he'd said during one of their many lessons. When people show you who they are, let them finish. Then respond with evidence they can't dispute. Elijah breathed deeply, calculating the timing. The woman's Instagram follower count was climbing. The hashtag #HowardFirstClassFraud was starting to trend on her feed. In a few minutes, it would be time to reveal the truth, but not before the lesson had fully developed. Despite his outward composure, Elijah felt his heart racing. What if his voice cracked when he finally spoke up? What if he forgot the careful wording his father had practiced with him for situations like this? For a moment, doubt crept in. He was, after all, only 16, not the fully formed executive his father had been grooming him to become. He thought about his father lying in that hospital bed, working through speech therapy exercises after the stroke that had nearly taken him. William Reynolds Jr. had built Atlantic Airways from a regional carrier with 2 planes into the nation's 5th largest airline. He'd faced discrimination, banking rejection, and industry skepticism. But he'd prevailed through intelligence, persistence, and strategic thinking. Never use your power as a first resort, his father had taught him. Use it when it creates the greatest impact for positive change. Elijah felt the weight of 3 generations pressing on his shoulders. His grandfather, who fought for the right to fly when America said black men didn't belong in cockpits. His father, who built an airline when the industry said black men didn't belong in boardrooms. And now himself, sitting calmly while being told he didn't belong in a first-class seat on his own family's airline. The irony wasn't lost on him. The portfolio felt heavier in his pocket as the woman's live stream continued. Patience, he reminded himself. Just a little longer. James and Helen Rodriguez had been married for 47 years. From their seats in 3A and 3B, they had a perfect view of the confrontation unfolding in front of them. James leaned toward his wife, whispering in Spanish. "The lady has a point. Look at how the boy is dressed." Helen nodded, adjusting her reading glasses. "In our day, people dressed properly for air travel. We saved for months for these tickets. Some people have no respect for standards." What they wouldn't say, was that the boy's skin color reinforced their assumptions. They had grown up in an era when knowing your place was considered a virtue, and they had internalized certain beliefs without ever examining them. James glanced at his watch, an expensive gift from their children on their 45th anniversary. "This delay will make us late for Carmela's graduation lunch." Helen sighed, her gaze lingering on the confrontation. Something about the boy's composure stirred an uncomfortable memory. 35 years ago, their own son Miguel had come home in tears after being asked to leave a country club swimming pool despite being a guest of his white friend's family. They had comforted him, explained that some people were just like that, told him not to make a fuss. "James," she whispered, doubt creeping into her voice. "Remember Miguel at the Hillcrest Club?" Her husband stiffened slightly. That was different. Was it Helen watched as the flight attendant verified the boy's ticket and Patricia continued her accusations regardless? The parallel was becoming uncomfortably clear. Across the aisle, Sofia Alvarez recognized exactly what was happening. The young mother had experienced similar treatment herself, particularly when traveling with her infant son. People saw a young Hispanic woman with a baby and immediately assumed she belonged in economy or shouldn't be traveling at all. "Look, Mateo," she whispered to her sleeping 6-month-old. Someone else fighting the same battle. She quietly began recording on her phone, not for social media, but as evidence. Too many of these incidents went undocumented, allowing people to dismiss them as overreactions or misunderstandings. Sophia had learned to carry her own documentation. Premium boarding passes, printed rather than digital membership cards, prominently displayed even a letter from her tech company confirming her executive status for international travel. The extra steps were exhausting but necessary armor against the assumptions that followed her through premium spaces. 3 rows back, Richard Coleman watched with growing approval as Patricia continued her live stream. The financial services executive had encountered his share of airline frauds, people trying to sneak into premium cabins, helping themselves to first-class amenities, or attempting to use counterfeit boarding passes. He considered it a matter of principle, people should stay where they belong. "About time someone spoke up," he murmured to himself, straightening his tie. "These airlines are too afraid of backlash to enforce their own policies." Coleman prided himself on his meritocratic worldview. He had worked hard for his Success State College while holding 2 jobs, entry-level positions, steady promotions earned through dedication. The fact that his path hadn't included the systematic barriers others faced didn't factor into his perspective. In his mind, his first-class seat was earned, and others potentially were not. Meanwhile, Daniel Park was rapidly becoming a secondary chronicler of the incident. The tech executive had initially been annoyed by the disruption but quickly recognized the situation for what it was. His fingers moved swiftly across his phone screen as he detailed the encounter on Twitter. Witnessing disturbing scene on #Atlantic Airways flight. Woman accusing teenager of not belonging in first class based solely on appearance. Hap travel while black. His first tweet already had 30 retweets. His followers, many from the tech industry, were responding with similar stories or expressions of outrage. Daniel had experienced his share of discrimination as an Asian American, though it manifested differently. He recognized the familiar patterns playing out in front of him. At the front of the cabin, Gabriela Mendez struggled with conflicting priorities. Atlantic Airways training emphasized de-escalation and customer satisfaction, but which customer should she prioritize, the platinum-level frequent flyer making a scene, or the quiet teenager with the unusual boarding pass? Something about that boarding pass had caught her attention. It wasn't just the platinum color reserved for the airline's highest-tier passengers. It was the code printed in the corner, an executive authorization she'd only seen once before when the airline's vice president had flown on her route. First Officer Michael Vega observed the commotion from the cockpit doorway. Captain Blackwell had sent him to assess the situation while he communicated with ground operations. "What's the status?" Michael asked Gabriela quietly. "Passenger dispute," she replied. "Ms. Whitfield is questioning the young man's right to be in first class. I've verified his boarding pass. He's authorized." Michael frowned. "That's it. That's what's delaying us. She's live streaming it. It's escalating." Michael glanced at the teenager who sat calmly despite the commotion. Something about the young man's composure struck him as unusual. Most passengers would be flustered, angry, or defensive in this situation. This kid seemed almost expectant, like he was waiting for something. "Captain's on the phone with someone from corporate," Michael said. "Seems unusually concerned about this particular situation." Ground Supervisor Anthony Torres pushed through the jetway door, clipboard in hand. 22 years with Atlantic Airways had taught him to handle delicate situations with diplomacy, but the urgency of the call from operations had alarmed him. "What's the situation?" he asked Gabriela, his voice low. Before she could answer, Patricia turned her camera toward him. Finally, "Someone with authority. This person is clearly in the wrong section. I need you to check his credentials." Anthony glanced at his tablet, scrolling through the passenger manifest. His expression remained neutral, but internally alarm bells were ringing. The name highlighted on his screen, Elijah Reynolds, had appeared in a company-wide memo just 3 weeks ago, though few had paid attention to the significance at the time. If this was the same Elijah Reynolds, this situation had just become far more complicated than a simple seating dispute. Patricia's Instagram Live had taken on a life of its own. The viewer count pushed past 1,200, with comments streaming in faster than anyone could possibly read them. What had begun as a localized incident was rapidly becoming a viral moment, spreading beyond her followers to wider social media. "I'm still waiting for someone to verify this supposed first-class ticket," Patricia announced to her audience camera, trained on Anthony Torres as he reviewed his tablet. Amazing how long it takes to confirm what's obviously a mistake. Behind the scenes of her broadcast, complex algorithms were amplifying the conflict. Instagram's engagement metrics registered the rapid increase in comments shares and viewer count, automatically pushing the live stream to suggested feeds. Content moderation bots flagged potential racial keywords but rated the stream below intervention thresholds. Meanwhile, third-party aggregation services were already clipping the most contentious moments for redistribution across platforms. The hashtag #FirstClassRacism had begun trending in direct opposition to Patricia's own #FirstClassFraud tag. Daniel Park's Twitter thread had expanded to 15 posts each, detailing a new development in the confrontation. His following, primarily tech industry professionals and journalists, had amplified his coverage to over 25,000 views in mere minutes. Flight attendant has verified teen's ticket. Woman still insisting he doesn't belong. Ground supervisor now involved. #FirstClassRacism. Atlantic Airways. In Atlantic Airways' corporate headquarters, the social media monitoring team had activated crisis protocols. Elena Vasquez, Chief of Staff to CEO William Reynolds Jr., watched the real-time analytics with growing concern. The airline's mention rate had spiked 4,000% in the last 20 minutes, with sentiment trending sharply negative. "Get me direct access to Captain Blackwell," she instructed her assistant, "and prepare a preliminary statement acknowledging the situation without specifics." The PR team had already identified Patricia's live stream and was recording it for internal review. Legal counsel had been notified with particular attention to potential civil rights violations and brand damage assessment. Back on the aircraft, the atmosphere had grown increasingly tense. The latest delay announcement, Flight 847, now delayed approximately 25 minutes, had prompted groans from economy passengers, many of whom had no idea about the drama unfolding in first class. "Security needs to handle this now," Patricia insisted, her voice carrying throughout the cabin. "We have schedules to keep." Anthony Torres maintained his professional demeanor despite his growing discomfort. The passenger manifest confirmed his suspicions. The name, the authorization code, the notation next to the booking all pointed to what he now suspected but could hardly believe. His 22 years with the company might not survive the next 10 minutes if he mishandled this situation. "Sir," he addressed Elijah directly, "could I please see your identification and boarding pass?" Elijah reached for his wallet with deliberate calm. As he did, something fell from his jacket pocket, a leather portfolio, expensive-looking despite its worn edges. He quickly retrieved it, but not before several passengers noticed the embossed logo on the front, the distinctive Atlantic Airways emblem, but in a design variant reserved for executive-level materials. "Here you go." Elijah handed over his driver's license and boarding pass. Anthony studied them carefully, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. He looked at Elijah again, then back at the documents, then at his tablet. Patricia's live stream captured his growing discomfort as his fingers scrolled urgently through additional passenger information. "This is taking too long," Patricia announced to her audience, now numbering over 1,500 viewers. "How hard is it to verify a fake ticket?" Airport security officers Teresa Gonzalez and Brian Walker appeared at the aircraft door responding to the call about a passenger dispute. They surveyed the scene with professional caution. Ma'am, Anthony said slowly, addressing Patricia, "I need you to lower your voice and end your live stream." "Absolutely not," she replied. "This is America. I have rights." Sophia Alvarez had heard enough. "You have the right to be racist on social media," she called out, her sleeping baby now stirring from the commotion. "That's not a right I'd be proud of." "Racist?" Patricia whirled around her camera, capturing her indignant expression. "This has nothing to do with race. This is about proper procedures and airline security. I'd question anyone who looked out of place." But her face had flushed deeper, her voice climbing to a pitch that betrayed exactly what this was really about. Helen Rodriguez nudged her husband, speaking quietly but firmly in Spanish. "James, this isn't right. That woman is doing to this boy exactly what they did to Miguel." James shifted uncomfortably. "We don't know the full situation." "We know enough," Helen replied, then surprised her husband by raising her voice to address Patricia directly. "Excuse me, but the flight attendant already checked his ticket. Perhaps we should trust the professionals to do their jobs." The unexpected intervention from the elderly Hispanic woman created a momentary pause in the confrontation. Patricia seemed taken aback that someone she might have expected support from was instead challenging her. Richard Coleman rose from his seat. "Let's all calm down. The airline has procedures for a reason." Daniel Park didn't miss a beat, adding to his thread white male passenger now joining in defending woman's concerns about black teen's presence. Elderly Hispanic couple just spoke up in teen's defense, cabin dividing along visible lines. First-class racism. His post was retweeted 300 times within seconds. Teresa Gonzalez approached Anthony. "Sir, we received a call about a passenger issue." Anthony Torres had gone pale, staring at his tablet as if it contained life-altering news. "I think there might be a misunderstanding here," he managed to say. "No misunderstanding," Patricia declared, turning her camera toward the security team. "This teenager is sitting in first class with what's obviously a fraudulent ticket. Remove him so we can all get where we're going." Patricia's viewer count had hit 1-800. The comments were coming so fast, they formed a continuous blur of text. Hashtag first-class fraud was now trending nationally, but so was hashtag black in first class and flying. While black creating a social media battlefield that extended far beyond the aircraft. 5 minutes to mandatory departure time came the announcement. "We need to resolve this situation immediately." That's when Captain Thomas Blackwell emerged from the cockpit. 30 years of flying former Air Force pilot, he'd seen everything from terrorist scares to medical emergencies. But right now, walking down the aisle toward the commotion in first class, he looked distinctly uncomfortable. Patricia immediately redirected her phone toward him. "Captain, thank God. Please remove this passenger so we can depart." Captain Blackwell looked at Patricia, then at Anthony. Then his eyes found Elijah. The teenager was watching him with interest, now no longer gazing out the window. "Mr. Reynolds," the captain said quietly. "Not son, not young man. Mr. Reynolds." The formality hung in the air like a question mark. Patricia's live stream audience caught it immediately. Comments exploded with speculation. "Why is the captain being so respectful? Something's not right here. This kid must be somebody." Captain Blackwell. Elijah replied, standing for the first time since the confrontation began. As he rose, his presence seemed to change. He was tall for 16, nearly 6 feet, and there was something in his posture that hadn't been obvious while he was seated, a kind of natural authority that made people unconsciously step back and give him space. Even the security officers seemed to sense it, exchanging glances. "I apologize for the delay," Captain Blackwell said, his voice carrying the deference usually reserved for VIP passengers. "Not your fault," Elijah replied calmly. "Though we should probably get underway soon. I have a board meeting at 2. "A board meeting. Not a meeting. A board meeting." Patricia was still filming, but confusion was creeping into her commentary. "I don't understand what's happening here. Why is everyone treating this kid like—" She trailed off as Captain Blackwell leaned down and whispered something in Elijah's ear. The teenager nodded, then reached for his leather portfolio. Anthony Torres had gone completely pale. Whatever was on his tablet screen had finally clicked into place. He was staring at Elijah like he'd seen a ghost. "Oh no," he whispered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Oh God, no." Daniel Park's Twitter thread had gone viral. 30,000 retweets and climbing. Major news accounts were picking it up. #first-class racism was trending nationally now, with subsidiary hashtags spawning by the minute. But the people on the plane were about to discover that all those hashtags were missing a crucial piece of information. William Reynolds Sr. had never expected to fly planes for America. As a young black man in 1940s Alabama, his dreams of aviation had been met with laughter, ridicule, or worse. But history had other plans. The Tuskegee Airmen program, the Army Air Force's segregated unit for black pilots, had given him his chance. "The sky doesn't care about your color," he would later tell his son. "Gravity treats everyone the same." That philosophy carried William Sr. through nearly 200 combat missions over Europe, where his P-51 Mustang fighter, nicknamed Higher Ground, became feared by German pilots. It also sustained him through the bitter irony of returning home as a decorated war hero to a country that still refused him service at lunch counters. The leather portfolio that now rested in his grandson's hands had been with William Sr. through it all, containing flight logs, mission briefings, and later the business plan for what began as Reynolds Air Service in 1955. 2 small planes offering charter flights between underserved southern communities operating from airfields that wouldn't turn away a black-owned business. William Reynolds Jr. inherited both the portfolio and his father's determination. Under his leadership, Reynolds Air Service expanded to scheduled flights, then regional routes, eventually merging with Atlantic Regional to form Atlantic Airways in the late 1980s. The transition hadn't been easy. Investors questioned whether passengers would trust an airline with a black CEO. Banks were reluctant to provide expansion capital. They never said it was about race, William Jr. had explained to young Elijah during one of their many lessons. They used words like market uncertainty and customer preferences. But we knew. We always knew. When William Jr. suffered his stroke 3 weeks ago, collapsing during a board meeting, Elijah had been in school taking a calculus exam. The emergency text from his mother had sent him rushing to the hospital where doctors delivered the prognosis William would survive, but recovery would take months, possibly a year. The medical leave created an immediate leadership crisis. Atlantic Airways' stock dropped 12% in a single day as investors questioned the company's stability without its founder at the helm. The board had gathered in William's hospital room, seeking his input on interim leadership. To everyone's shock, except perhaps William's wife Diana, he had pointed to his 16-year-old son. "Elijah knows this business better than anyone except me." William had insisted, his speech slightly slurred from the stroke. "He's been preparing for this his entire life." The board's reluctance was obvious. The airline's general counsel had pointed out regulatory concerns about a minor in an executive position. The CFO questioned his ability to make financial decisions. The COO worried about employee confidence. William had forced himself to sit up straighter in his hospital bed, his voice finding some of its former strength. "My father fought for the right to fly when this country said black men didn't belong in cockpits. I built this airline when the industry said black men didn't belong in boardrooms. Now my son will lead it regardless of what anyone thinks about his age." The compromise came in the form of a limited interim operational authority resolution. Elijah would handle customer experience service standards and public representation. The executive team would manage day-to-day operations, with Elijah having final approval on major decisions. Elena Vasquez-Williams' trusted chief of staff would serve as executive liaison. The arrangement was intended to be largely ceremonial, while William recovered a symbolic continuity of Reynolds' family leadership to reassure investors, employees, and customers. No one had expected Elijah to actually exercise his authority so soon or in such a public way. From childhood, Elijah had been immersed in the airline business. While other kids played with toy planes, he studied route maps, where others saw summer vacations as a break from learning. Elijah spent his shadows in his father's office, absorbing every aspect of the company. By 14, he could recite load factors, fleet specifications, and competitor analyses from memory. William Jr. had been deliberate in his son's preparation, particularly in handling discrimination. It's not enough to be right, he would tell Elijah. You have to be strategic. Pick your moments. Understand when to speak and when to listen. Know when to reveal your power and when to keep it hidden. The lessons included practical simulations. William would take Elijah to high-end stores dressed in casual clothes, quietly observing how security followed them. They would book restaurant reservations, arrive separately, and note the different treatment. William would deliberately book economy tickets, then watch how gate agents responded to upgrade requests. Observe everything he instructed. The facial expressions, the tone changes, the body language. These are the subtle signals people send when they've decided you don't belong. The most important lesson came after each experience, the debrief. William never encouraged anger or resentment. Instead, he focused on analysis and strategy. Anger is easy, he would say. Anyone can be angry. The real power lies in maintaining your dignity while helping others recognize their prejudice. But this theoretical training hadn't fully prepared Elijah for the reality of being in charge. Since his interim appointment, he'd struggled with doubts he couldn't share with anyone. At night alone in his room, he would sometimes feel the weight of responsibility crushing him. What if he made decisions that cost people their jobs? What if the stock continued to fall under his leadership? What if he simply wasn't ready? His friends knew nothing about his new role. To them, he was still just Elijah, the quiet kid who was good at math and sometimes missed weekend plans because of family obligations. His dual existence, high school junior by day, airline executive by night, created a strange isolation he wasn't prepared for. The Reynolds family dinner table had become a de facto board meeting with Elijah, briefing his mother and sister about the day's corporate developments while other families discussed homework and sports practices. His older sister Zoe, studying aerospace engineering at Stanford, had cut short a semester abroad to help support the family during the transition. These complexities were invisible to Patricia Whitfield, who saw only what she expected to see a teenager who didn't match her mental image of a first-class passenger. For Patricia, prejudice wasn't something she consciously acknowledged. Raised in an affluent suburb with minimal diversity, educated at exclusive private schools, and employed by a marketing firm where she was one of 24 white executives, Patricia had never been forced to confront her biases. She considered herself progressive, even enlightened. She supported the right causes on social media. She had once attended a black colleague's wedding. She never used racial slurs and corrected others who did. In her mind, these surface-level behaviors absolved her from deeper examination. Her Instagram following, primarily other white professionals who shared her worldview, reinforced her self-perception as someone who didn't see color. Her twice-weekly first-class flights for client meetings had become a status marker, a validation of her success and belonging. The presence of someone who didn't fit her mental image of a first-class passenger triggered an immediate unconscious response. Not just because Elijah was black, but because his youth and casual attire violated her sense of what belonged in her space. What Patricia couldn't know as she continued her live stream was that behind her comfortable certainty lay a recent personal humiliation. Just 3 months earlier, she had been passed over for promotion in favor of a younger colleague with less experience but an Ivy League pedigree. The rejection had shaken her confidence, making her grip her status symbols, including her first-class seat, even more tightly. As the confrontation on Flight 847 escalated, neither Patricia nor the watching passengers realized they were witnessing the convergence of 3 generations of struggle and preparation, all contained in the leather portfolio Elijah now held in his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elijah said, his voice carrying clearly through first class and into the rows behind. "I apologize for the disruption to your travel today." Something in his tone made everyone stop talking. Even Patricia's stream went quiet, her audience of nearly 2,000 viewers hanging on every word. "There seems to be some confusion about my presence on this aircraft," Elijah continued. He pulled a single document from his portfolio, holding it so everyone could see the official letterhead. "I'd like to clear that up now." Anthony Torres was backing away, his face a mask of horror as he realized what was about to happen. 22 years with the company, and he was about to witness a career-ending moment. Patricia stepped closer with her phone, determined to capture whatever document this teenager thought would save him from embarrassment. "This better be good," she muttered to her audience, not realizing her microphone was picking up everything. It was about to be better than she could possibly imagine, and infinitely worse than she could possibly survive. Elijah held the document up so everyone in first class could see the official letterhead. The logo was unmistakable, the same one that appeared on every safety card, every piece of airline literature, every employee badge in the cabin. "This is a board resolution," he said quietly, "dated 3 weeks ago." Patricia zoomed in with her phone, trying to read the text. Her audience was at peak attention. Over 2,200 viewers, now comments flying faster than humanly possible to read. Effective immediately. Elijah continued upon the medical leave of CEO William Reynolds, Jr. Due to stroke-related complications, interim operational authority is transferred to... He paused, looking directly at Patricia's camera. "Elijah Reynolds III." "That's me." The silence that followed was absolute. Anthony Torres dropped his tablet. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. His face had gone from pale to ashen, the color of someone watching their career implode in real time. Patricia's phone kept recording, but no words came out of her mouth. Her face cycled through expressions: confusion, disbelief, horror, the slow dawning realization of what she'd just done. Her viewer count was climbing past 200 to 500, but the comments were no longer supportive. Furthermore, Elijah continued, his voice still calm, but now carrying unmistakable authority. The resolution grants full authority over personnel decisions, operational procedures, and customer service policies during the transition period. Captain Blackwell stood at attention now, not the nervous deference from before, but full military bearing. 30 years of flying had taught him to recognize command presence, and this teenager possessed it in abundance. Gabriela Mendez had gone pale. 8 years of customer service experience, and she'd never seen anything like this. Her training manual had no section on what to do when a passenger turns out to be your CEO. The security officers exchanged glances, suddenly unsure why they'd been called. The problem passenger they'd come to remove was now looking more like the person who signed their paychecks. Daniel Park's Twitter fingers were flying. His thread was exploding across social media. Breaking. The teenager accused of fraud is actually the interim CEO of the airline. This is the most insane thing I've ever witnessed on a plane. Hashtag first class racism. Atlantic Airways. The tweet was retweeted 500 times in 30 seconds. In economy class, passengers were straining to hear what was happening. Flight attendants were whispering urgently among themselves. Word was spreading through the aircraft like wildfire. Something unprecedented was happening in first class. The elderly couple who'd been whispering support for Patricia were now looking at each other in shock. Helen Rodriguez gripped her husband's hand, her earlier suspicions confirmed. "James," she whispered, "this is exactly like Miguel's situation, but with very different power dynamics." James nodded slowly, the parallel impossible to ignore now. That's impossible," Patricia finally found her voice. "You're just a kid. This is some kind of joke." Her Instagram Live comments were brutal now. "Delete this stream. You're finished. This kid owns the airline." Screenshots were being taken faster than she could process what was happening. Elijah reached back into his portfolio and pulled out a second document. "Here's yesterday's Wall Street Journal," he said, unfolding the business section. Page 1 of the business section. He held it up. The headline read, "Atlantic Airways CEO suffers stroke. Son prepared for interim role." Below it was a photo of Elijah in a suit standing beside his father in front of an Atlantic Airways plane. The resemblance between them was unmistakable. The article, Elijah continued, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd grown up in boardrooms, mentions that the transition has been planned for months, that I've been shadowing executives, attending strategy meetings, learning operations from the ground up. Patricia's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone steady. Her live stream was chaos. People were joining just to watch the meltdown, sharing the link across every platform imaginable. But the people watching in person were experiencing something different. This wasn't just about a mistaken identity anymore. This was about power, real power, and what happened when you attacked someone who had more of it than you could imagine. The article also mentions, Elijah continued conversationally, that I've been preparing for this role since I was 12. Board meetings, operational training, financial analysis, customer service evaluation. My father believed in learning the business from the ground up. He gestured around the cabin with a slight smile, including understanding what our customers experience when they fly with us, especially customers who might not look like traditional first-class passengers. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Anthony Torres was hyperventilating. 22 years with the company. His pension was 18 months away. His daughter was starting college in the fall, and he had just publicly humiliated the person who could end his career with a phone call. "Mr. Reynolds," he stammered, his voice breaking. "Sir, I didn't know. I was just trying to follow protocol." "Of course you didn't know," Elijah replied, his tone neither angry nor forgiving, just matter of fact. "How could you? I was just a black kid in a hoodie sitting where someone like me wasn't supposed to be." The words landed like physical blows. Patricia was still filming, but her commentary had stopped entirely. The comments on her live stream had turned vicious. People were screenshotting her profile, sharing her employer information, calling for boycotts of her company. Sofia Alvarez was recording too, now her phone capturing Patricia's meltdown for her own social media followers. "This is why you mind your own business," she whispered to her camera. "Karma is real, y'all." Other passengers were frantically Googling Elijah Reynolds, Atlantic Airways CEO. The results were overwhelming. Business journals, aviation industry publications, press releases. The kid they'd been watching get humiliated was part of a family worth an estimated $2.7 billion. Ma'am, Elijah addressed Patricia directly, his voice cutting through the chaos of her collapsing live stream. "You said I don't belong in first class. You said I was obviously lying about your ticket. You said airline security was everyone's responsibility." Patricia nodded mutely, still holding her phone but no longer able to speak to her audience. "You also said this had nothing to do with race," Elijah continued. "That you'd question anyone who looked out of place." He paused, letting that statement settle over the cabin. "I'm curious about that because earlier today I watched you board this aircraft." He walked past a man in first class wearing flip-flops, board shorts, and a tank top that says "Spring Break Forever." You didn't question his presence. Patricia's eyes darted toward the passenger Elijah was describing. He was indeed dressed exactly as stated, looking like he'd come straight from a beach vacation. He was now sinking lower in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. You also passed a woman traveling with 3 small children, all of whom were climbing over the seats during boarding. You didn't suggest she might have the wrong tickets. True again. The woman in question was now staring at Patricia with obvious disgust, her arms protectively around her children. There's a man in row 2 wearing a tracksuit and gold chains counting cash openly. You didn't find that suspicious. Every passenger Elijah mentioned was real, their presence confirming the selective nature of Patricia's security concerns. But a black teenager reading quietly in his assigned seat, bothering no one, making no noise. That was the security threat that required live streaming and public humiliation. Patricia tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. I didn't know." Elijah's phone vibrated with incoming messages. He glanced at the screen, briefly noting alerts from Elena Vasquez. The corporate response was now fully activated. PR was monitoring social media metrics. Legal was assessing potential liabilities. The board had been notified. Mr. Reynolds. Captain Blackwell said formally, his military bearing now complete. "What are your instructions, sir?" It was the question everyone was waiting for. Patricia's career, Anthony's pension, the flight itself, everything hung in the balance. Elijah looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of every passenger who'd been watching the confrontation. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that people who'd been filming him were now averting their cameras as if suddenly aware they were in the presence of royalty. For a brief moment, Elijah felt a wave of uncertainty. His father would know exactly what to do in this situation, but he was still finding his way. He could feel the weight of everyone's expectations, the passengers, the crew, the invisible audience watching through social media. What if he made the wrong decision? What if he couldn't live up to the Reynolds legacy? He took a deep breath, pushing the doubt aside. This wasn't just about him or Patricia. This was about setting a precedent that would affect countless passengers who looked like him but didn't have his resources or authority. The moment required both justice and wisdom. Patricia Whitfield's mind reeled as reality crashed down around her. The phone in her hand felt suddenly heavy, its live stream now a damning record of her behavior, rather than the validation she'd sought. Her carefully constructed self-image, successful executive, frequent first-class traveler, social media influencer, was disintegrating in real time. "This isn't happening," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the aircraft. But it was happening. The evidence was incontrovertible, the board resolution, the newspaper article, the obvious deference of the airline staff, and most damning of all, her own recorded words. Her thoughts raced through stages of denial with frightening speed. First came disbelief. This had to be an elaborate prank, some kind of reality show stunt. Perhaps the airline was filming a training video about discrimination. But Captain Blackwell's rigid posture and Anthony Torres's ashen face confirmed this was all too real. Next came anger, flaring hot and desperate. How was she supposed to know who this kid was? He didn't look like an executive. He wasn't wearing a suit. He didn't have bodyguards or assistants. He hadn't identified himself. This was his fault for the deception. But even as these thoughts formed, Patricia recognized their hollowness. The live stream comments scrolling past her screen echoed what her conscience already knew. She had made assumptions based solely on appearance, and those assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. "The kid owns the airline. You're finished. Your company is going to fire you by tomorrow. This is the most expensive mistake I've ever seen someone make." Bargaining began as her breathing quickened. Maybe she could explain this away. Everyone makes mistakes. She was just concerned about security. She'd apologize, of course, make it clear this was all a misunderstanding. She would emphasize her progressive values, her support for diversity initiatives, her black friend from college. But Elijah Reynolds's measured gaze told her that superficial apologies would not suffice. This wasn't a moment for damage control. This was a reckoning. Depression crashed over her as the full implications crystallized. Her company would see this. Her clients would see this. Her family would see this. A live stream viewed by thousands, archived forever, showing her demanding the removal of the teenage CEO of a major airline because he didn't look like he belonged. The professional reputation she'd spent 15 years building was evaporating before her eyes. Her hands trembled so violently that she nearly dropped her phone. Tears welled up, blurring her vision as the comments continued to stream past. Her follower count was actually decreasing in real time as people disconnected from her in disgust. "I didn't mean," she began, but the words died in her throat. What exactly hadn't she meant? To assume a black teenager didn't belong in first class? To publicly humiliate him? To demand his removal? She had meant all of those things, and the realization was devastating. Beneath the surface, humiliation lay a deeper, more painful truth. 3 months ago, when she'd been passed over for promotion, her boss had cited concerns about her interpersonal approach and collaborative style. She'd dismissed the feedback as corporate jargon masking favoritism for her younger Ivy League colleague. But now, watching herself through the lens of her own live stream, she glimpsed what others might have seen all along: entitlement, quick judgment, casual cruelty, dressed as concern. Sweat beaded on her forehead as physical symptoms of panic set in. Her heart pounded in her chest. The cabin suddenly felt too warm, too small, too crowded with judging eyes. The phone in her hand continued broadcasting her unraveling to an audience that had swelled beyond 3,000 viewers, many joining specifically to witness her downfall. Richard Coleman, who had supported her earlier, now stared straight ahead, pretending he'd never been involved. The elderly couple who had nodded along with her accusations were now engaged in an intense, whispered conversation, the wife appearing to rebuke her husband. She was utterly alone in a crowd of witnesses. Patricia's gaze fell to the floor as the final stage acceptance began to take hold. This was happening. It was real. There would be consequences. There should be consequences. "Ms. Whitfield." Elijah's voice startled her. She looked up, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Your Instagram Live currently has 3,245 viewers," he said, his voice neither cruel nor kind. "That's not counting the shares, the clips being extracted, or the screenshots circulating on other platforms. Your full name is visible on your profile, as is your company affiliation." He wasn't threatening her. He was simply stating facts. Somehow that made it worse. The incident is being covered on Twitter by multiple users, including a tech executive with significant following. News outlets have been alerted. By the time we land in San Francisco, this will be a national story. Patricia's tears came faster now, her breathing shallow and quick. The enormity of what she had done, what she had lost, crashed over her in waves. Why she whispered the question directed as much to herself as to Elijah. Why did I do this? The cabin fell silent, waiting for her answer to her own question. It was the most honest moment of the entire confrontation, a woman facing the prejudice she had never acknowledged even to herself. Because she said, her voice breaking, because I saw a young black man in casual clothes, and I assumed. The confession hung in the air, raw and painful and true. You assumed what Elijah prompted gently, that you couldn't afford first class, that you were trying to scam the system, that you didn't belong here with people like me. The admission fell like a stone into still water. Patricia's shoulders slumped as she finally spoke the truth that had been driving her behavior all along. "And why did you make those assumptions?" Elijah asked, his voice still calm but insistent. Patricia was crying harder now, but she was finally being honest. "Because that's what I've been taught to think, what I've always thought, that people who look like you don't belong in spaces like this." Elijah nodded slowly. "Thank you for being honest." He turned to address the entire cabin, his voice carrying to the passengers in economy who were straining to hear. "What we're witnessing isn't about one passenger or one incident. It's about assumptions. The belief that certain people don't belong in certain spaces. The confidence to act on those assumptions publicly." Patricia's live stream continued capturing everything, but she was beyond caring about damage control now. The truth had already been exposed, not just to her audience, but to herself. For the first time, Patricia Whitfield was seeing herself clearly, and the reflection was devastating. Behind her carefully constructed professional identity and social media persona lay a person who had never truly examined her own biases. She had created a version of herself, progressive, fair-minded, not seeing color, that bore little resemblance to her actual behavior. The cognitive dissonance between who she thought she was and who she had revealed herself to be was shattering. In that painful moment of clarity, something unexpected happened. Relief. The exhaustion of maintaining her false self-image gave way to the strange liberation of finally confronting the truth. It hurt. It hurt terribly, but it was real in a way her previous self-conception had never been. Whatever came next, career implosion, public shaming, personal reckoning, At least it would be built on something authentic rather than comfortable self-deception. Elijah Reynolds stood at his full height now, no longer the passive teenager trying to avoid conflict, but the interim CEO of a major airline addressing a critical situation. When he spoke, his voice carried the natural authority that came from years of preparation. "Captain Blackwell," he said, "what's our current departure status?" "We're approximately 28 minutes behind schedule, sir," the captain replied. "Ground operations is holding our departure slot for another 15 minutes before we'll need to request a new clearance." Elijah nodded, then turned to address the gathered crew and security personnel. "Let's be clear about what's happening here. This isn't just about a seating misunderstanding. This is about a passenger being profiled, recorded without consent, and publicly humiliated based on appearance." He pulled out his executive phone, not an iPhone like most teenagers carried, but a secure device with corporate access, and opened an app that displayed real-time company data. Atlantic Airways processes approximately 837,000 passengers weekly across 247 daily flights. We generate $47.8 billion in annual revenue. We employ 127,000 people worldwide. The numbers landed with the weight of absolute authority. This wasn't just a rich kid with a trust fund. This was someone who controlled an empire. Yet despite his outward composure, Elijah felt his mouth go dry. The statistics were his father's favorite way to establish control in tense situations. William Reynolds Jr. had used them countless times in board meetings and press conferences. But reciting them now, Elijah heard his own voice waver slightly on billion. Would anyone notice? Would they see through his performance to the anxious teenager beneath? He glanced at Captain Blackwell, whose expression remained professionally neutral. The momentary doubt shook him. Elijah took a breath, steadying himself. He could do this. He had to do this. This morning's incident, which is now being viewed by millions across social media platforms, represents a fundamental failure not just in our training or policies, but in our underlying culture. Anthony Torres stared at the floor, unable to meet Elijah's gaze. Gabriela Mendez stood straighter, recognizing the gravity of the moment. The security officers remained silent now, understanding they had been called to handle the wrong problem. "Ms. Whitfield." Elijah said, his voice gentler but still firm. "You made assumptions about me based on my appearance. You live-streamed those assumptions to thousands of people. You turned a routine flight into a public humiliation." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, her phone still recording her own breakdown. "But more than that, you revealed something about how we as a company have failed. Failed to create an environment where such assumptions feel inappropriate, where staff would intervene immediately, where other passengers would speak up against obvious discrimination." He looked at Anthony, at Gabriella, at the security officers still standing awkwardly in the aisle, at the passengers who'd watched it all happen. "That changes today." The cabin was so quiet you could hear individual passengers breathing. Patricia's live stream had become appointment viewing. People were texting friends to tune in, sharing links across every platform, watching history being made in real time. Elijah reached into his leather portfolio again and pulled out something that made Captain Blackwell's eyes widen with recognition and respect. A small, worn leather journal, the kind used for important records, family histories, things that mattered beyond business. "This belonged to my grandfather Elijah," said his voice softer now, carrying decades of family pride and pain. "William Reynolds Sr. He was a Tuskegee Airman." The historical weight of that statement settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Even passengers unfamiliar with the full history understood the significance. He fought for the right to fly when people said black men didn't belong in cockpits. He served his country with honor when his country didn't honor him back. Elijah opened the journal carefully, revealing pages of handwritten notes, old photographs, military commendations. "My father built an airline when people said we didn't belong in boardrooms. He started with one plane, a dream, and a determination to prove that excellence has no color." He looked directly at Patricia's camera, speaking to her audience of thousands. but also to the millions who would see this footage in the hours to come. And today I'm sitting in first class on my own airline being told I don't belong there. He closed the journal carefully, reverently. Some stories, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of generations, repeat themselves until someone has the power to change the ending. The weight of 3 generations of Reynolds' family legacy settled over the cabin like authority itself. Elijah carefully returned his grandfather's journal to the portfolio, then looked up at the assembled group passengers, crew security, all waiting for his next words. As the moment stretched, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face so brief that most missed it. What would his father do in this situation? The question had been his constant companion since taking on the interim role. The pressure to live up to William Reynolds Jr.'s legacy sometimes felt overwhelming. Now he said, his voice finding strength again. Let's talk about what happens next. He pulled out his executive phone and opened a detailed analytics dashboard. The screen showed real-time data that only senior executives had access to. Ms. Whitfield, your Instagram Live has been viewed by approximately 4.2 million people in the past 37 minutes. The video is being shared across platforms at a rate of approximately 12,000 shares per minute. Eliza Reynolds is trending in 43 countries. Patricia's face went from pale to green. She was still holding her phone, but her live stream had devolved into chaos comments, moving too fast to read her follower count actually dropping as people unfollowed her in real time. The financial impact of this incident is already measurable. Elijah continued scrolling through reports that were updating in real time. Our social media monitoring system shows Atlantic Airways mentioned in approximately 847,000 posts in the last hour. Sentiment analysis is complicated. He held up the phone so Captain Blackwell could see the dashboard. 67% positive sentiment praising our company for having young black leadership. 31% negative criticizing us for allowing discrimination to occur. 2% neutral. Anthony Torres was taking notes frantically as if documenting his own professional execution. From a legal standpoint, Elijah continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. Ms. Whitfield has created significant liability exposure for both herself and potentially her employer. He swiped to another screen. Federal aviation regulations, specifically 14 CFR Section 382, prohibit discrimination against passengers. Civil rights violations under Section 1983 carry damages averaging $1.8 million in settled cases. Patricia tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. I didn't know. Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Elijah continued as if reading from a legal brief, specifically covers public accommodations, including commercial aircraft. Violations can result in both monetary damages and injunctive relief. He looked up from his phone. That means, Ms. Whitfield, that you've potentially exposed yourself to federal civil rights charges regardless of whether I choose to pursue them. The security officers exchanged glances. This wasn't the kind of passenger dispute they were trained to handle. This was more like watching a federal case being built in real time. But legal consequences are just one aspect, Elijah said, switching screens again. Let's discuss the broader implications. Daniel Park was furiously tweeting updates, his thread now approaching 50,000 retweets. Other passengers were filming their own response videos, turning the cabin into a real-time content creation studio. Atlantic Airways stock is currently trading at $347.23 per share. Elijah announced, checking a financial app. In the past hour, volume has increased 340% above normal trading levels. The market is watching this story very carefully. He turned to Anthony Torres. Mr. Torres, in your 22 years with the company, how many discrimination complaints have you personally handled? Anthony stammered clearly, calculating in his head. Maybe 15, 20. Our internal records show 17 formal complaints filed against gate agents and ground staff in the Atlanta hub, alone over the past 18 months. Elijah corrected. all involving passengers of color being questioned about their ticket validity or seat assignments. The number hung in the air like an indictment of the entire system. None of those complaints resulted in policy changes. None resulted in additional training. None resulted in consequences for the staff involved. Gabriela Mendez was taking mental notes, realizing she was witnessing a masterclass in corporate accountability. That pattern, Elijah continued, suggests ingrained issues rather than isolated incidents, which brings us to today's decisions. He looked directly at Patricia, who was still crying quietly, her phone shaking in her hands. Ms. Whitfield, you have 3 options. I'm going to lay them out clearly, and you can choose how this story ends. The cabin was silent except for the ambient noise of the aircraft and Patricia's barely audible sobs. Option 1. You can continue your live stream. Apologize publicly to me and to the passengers who witnessed your behavior. Acknowledge that your actions were based on racial bias and commit to diversity training. In return, I won't pursue legal action, and Atlantic Airways will implement a passenger dignity protocol in your honor. Patricia looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. Option 2. You can end your stream now, delete the video, and pretend this never happened, in which case I will file federal discrimination charges, pursue maximum damages under civil rights law, and ensure this incident becomes a case study in every business school in America. The hope died quickly. Option 3. You can continue broadcasting, maintain that your actions weren't discriminatory, and defend your behavior. In that case, I will not only pursue all legal remedies, but I will also personally ensure that every airline, hotel, and transportation company in America knows exactly who you are and how you treat their customers. The ultimatum was delivered with the calm precision of someone who'd learned negotiation from billionaire parents. Patricia tried to speak, her voice barely audible. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell the truth. Elijah replied simply. To your audience, to these passengers, to yourself. Why did you single me out? What was it about my appearance that made you assume I didn't belong in first class? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia's live stream was still running, still being watched by thousands of people, still recording her potential redemption or complete destruction. As Patricia wrestled with her response, the impact of Elijah's revelation rippled through the cabin, creating distinct factions among the passengers and crew. Elena Vasquez strode through Atlantic Airways' Crisis Management Center with purposeful energy, coordinating the company's response in real time. As chief of staff, she maintained the delicate balance between corporate interests and the Reynolds family's values, a balance currently being tested at 30,000 feet. What's our latest exposure assessment? She asked, addressing the assembled team of PR specialists, legal counsel, and social media analysts. Twitter mentions up 12,000% in the last hour, reported Samantha Liu, head of social monitoring. Traditional media picking up the story. CNN has a breaking news alert. Fox Business is covering the stock fluctuation. MSNBC has requested comment. On the aircraft, the first-class cabin had transformed from a travel compartment into a microcosm of American society, with alliances shifting as rapidly as the viral story unfolded. James and Helen Rodriguez, the elderly Hispanic couple who had initially supported Patricia's challenge, now sat rigid with embarrassment. James kept his eyes fixed on the flight magazine, pretending to be absorbed in an article about vacation destinations. Helen stared out the window, her lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer. Helen whispered in Spanish, "We were wrong, just like those people at Hillcrest were wrong about Miguel." James nodded slowly, a lifetime of unexamined assumptions suddenly visible in harsh light. "We should apologize to the young man." "Not now," Helen cautioned. "Let him handle this first, then we make amends." Their quiet reckoning represented thousands of similar conversations happening across America as the incident went viral, people confronting their own complicity in everyday discrimination. Across the aisle, Sofia Alvarez had become an unexpected documentarian, her phone recording Patricia's unraveling from a different angle than the live stream. She bounced her now awake son gently on her knee, whispering commentary to her own social media audience. "This is what accountability looks like in real time," she narrated softly. "This young man isn't just changing one person's perspective, he's changing an entire corporate culture while we watch." Her followers, primarily other young mothers and Latina professionals, were responding with enthusiastic support. Some shared their own stories of being questioned or challenged in first-class cabins or other exclusive spaces. Others expressed hope that Elijah's actions would create ripple effects throughout the transportation industry. Richard Coleman, who had initially supported Patricia's security concerns, was now studiously avoiding eye contact with anyone. The financial services executive had recognized the shifting power dynamic and was frantically texting his own assistant. "Need background on Reynolds family ASAP. Potential business opportunity if handled correctly." Young CEO seemed sharp. His rapid pivot from discrimination enabler to potential business partner revealed the calculating nature behind his initial support for Patricia. It wasn't about security, it was about aligning with what he had perceived as the dominant force in the cabin. Now that power had shifted, so had his allegiance. At corporate headquarters, legal teams were mapping potential outcomes. "If she chooses option 1, we structure the training program as non-punitive education rather than punitive correction," advised David Friedman, General Counsel. "Transforms her from liability to asset." Elena nodded, watching the live stream on the wall-mounted screen. "And Anthony Torres. His mishandling creates exposure, but also opportunity. If Reynolds positions him as implementation lead for the new protocols, it becomes a redemption narrative rather than a termination story." On screen, Patricia was struggling with her response to Elijah's ultimatum, tears streaming down her face as millions watched her career implode in real time. "Should we intervene?" Rachel Torres, PR director, asked. "We could have Captain Blackwell end the broadcast site aviation regulations." Elena shook her head. "No. This is Elijah's moment. William would want him to handle this his way." On the aircraft, Daniel Park had become the incident's primary chronicler on Twitter. His thread, now at 47 posts and growing, provided moment-by-moment updates that were being quoted by major news outlets. Young CEO now offering 3 options to woman who profiled him. Masterclass in crisis management, happening on Atlantic Airways Flight 847. Flying. While black, hushed corporate accountability. His tech industry followers were sharing the thread extensively, with many tagging their own company's diversity officers and HR departments with comments like, "Required reading," and "This is how you handle discrimination." Throughout the cabin, passengers were making choices. Some were deliberately turning away, uncomfortable with witnessing Patricia's public humiliation. Others were leaning in, feeling part of a historic moment. A few were quietly deleting their own social media posts, supporting Patricia from earlier in the confrontation, trying to erase their involvement. The flight attendants moving through the cabin felt the shifting dynamics acutely. Those who had initially hesitated to challenge Patricia now appeared overly solicitous toward Elijah, offering water, adjusting his seat, ensuring his comfort. Their sudden attentiveness wasn't lost on the other passengers, who noted how quickly service standards adjusted once power was revealed. As Patricia considered her options, the cabin held its collective breath. Her decision wouldn't just determine her own fate, it would reveal something essential about accountability, redemption, and the possibility of genuine change in the face of undeniable truth. The microcosm that had formed in first class was in many ways a perfect reflection of the larger societal reckoning happening outside the aircraft, a test of whether acknowledging bias could lead to meaningful transformation, both personal and institutional. The silence in first class seemed to stretch endlessly as Patricia Whitfield faced the 3 options Elijah Reynolds had presented. Her live stream continued broadcasting her tear-stained face to an audience that had swelled beyond 4,000 viewers, all waiting for her response. "I choose option 1, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the aircraft. Elijah nodded once, acknowledging her decision. "Then please proceed." Patricia took a deep, shuddering breath and turned to face her phone camera directly. The moment held weight beyond the immediate circumstance. This was a public accounting, a reckoning with bias that would be viewed by millions. To everyone watching, and especially to Mr. Reynolds, she began, her voice trembling. "I want to apologize for my behavior today. I made assumptions about this young man based solely on his appearance. I decided he didn't belong in first class because of how he looked and because he's black." The words hung in the air, raw and uncomfortable but necessary. "I've always considered myself a good person, someone who doesn't see color. But today has shown me that's not true. I do see color, and I make judgments based on it, even if I didn't want to admit that to myself." Tears streamed down her face, but she continued, the words flowing more easily now that she had begun. There was nothing about Mr. Reynolds' behavior that warranted suspicion. He was quietly reading, bothering no one. "I passed other passengers who didn't fit my image of first class, but I didn't question them because they were white. That's the truth I need to acknowledge." Captain Blackwell stood impassively at the front of the cabin, but his eyes reflected a grudging respect for Patricia's candor. Anthony Torres continued taking notes, documenting every word of her confession. "I'm deeply sorry for the humiliation I caused, for the disruption to everyone's travel, and for revealing the kind of prejudice that makes spaces feel unwelcoming and unsafe for people of color. I commit to taking diversity training and to examining my own biases more honestly." She paused, wiping tears with her free hand. "And I want to thank Mr. Reynolds for giving me this opportunity to acknowledge my mistake and try to make amends when he had every right to pursue more severe consequences." Patricia looked up from her phone to meet Elijah's gaze directly. "I'm truly sorry." The young CEO studied her for a moment, assessing the sincerity of her words. Then he nodded again, his expression solemn. "Apology accepted, Ms. Whitfield. But more importantly, I hope your actions going forward prove you meant what you said today." He turned to address Captain Blackwell. "I believe we're cleared for departure now, Captain. Let's get these passengers to San Francisco." "Yes, sir," Blackwell replied, turning to head back to the cockpit. "One moment," Elijah called after him. The captain paused as Elijah once again addressed the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we depart, I want to make one thing clear. What you've witnessed today isn't just about one incident or one person's bias. It's about a broader pattern that affects countless travelers every day." He stood at his full height, his presence commanding the attention of everyone aboard. Effective immediately, Atlantic Airways is implementing what we're calling the Passenger Dignity Protocol. Any customer complaint based solely on appearance or assumptions about economic status will be flagged for review by our newly established diversity officers. Anthony Torres looked up from his notes, surprised by the immediate policy announcement. "Second," Elijah continued, "we're establishing a direct reporting system. Passengers can text complaints to a diversity hotline that reports directly to my office. The number will be added to our in-flight materials by the end of this week." Gabriela Mendez and the other flight attendants exchanged glances, realizing how significantly their jobs might change under these new protocols. "Third, we will be partnering with the NAACP and other civil rights organizations to conduct monthly audits of our customer service practices. These audits will be transparent with public reports available on our website." The scope of the changes was breathtaking. Elijah wasn't just addressing this incident. He was using it to transform an entire corporate culture. "Mr. Torres." Elijah turned to the ground supervisor, who straightened immediately at being addressed. "You will oversee the implementation of these protocols in Atlanta. Consider it your path to redemption." Relief flooded Anthony's face as he realized his career might survive this incident after all. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Captain Blackwell, I want crew training on unconscious bias to begin next week, mandatory for all customer-facing staff. Yes, sir, the captain nodded. The captain. And Ms. Mendez-Elijah turned to Gabriella. You handled this situation with professionalism despite the circumstances. You're being promoted to our new Chief Customer Experience Officer position. Salary increase of 40% effective immediately. Gabriella's eyes widened in shock and gratitude. Mr. Reynolds, I thank you. Patricia was still holding her phone, still live streaming, but her audience had swelled to over 6,000 viewers. The comments were split between those calling for her complete destruction and those praising her for finally telling the truth. Elijah pulled a business card from his portfolio and handed it to her. This is the contact information for our diversity training program. 6 months, fully paid with job protection guaranteed by federal anti-retaliation laws. Your employer will receive a letter explaining that you're participating in court-approved sensitivity training. Patricia took the card with shaking hands. But understand this, Elijah continued, his voice hardening slightly. This is your one chance. If you ever discriminate against anyone again, anywhere, and it reaches me, there will be no options, no negotiations, no second chances. The warning was delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had both the resources and the will to follow through. Do you understand? Patricia nodded, tears still streaming down her face. Yes. Yes, I understand. And I'm sorry to you, to your family, to everyone watching. I was wrong. Elijah studied her for a moment, then nodded. Apology accepted, but more importantly, make sure your actions going forward prove you meant it. He looked around the cabin one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to San Francisco. When we land, this story will probably be on the news. You've all witnessed something that will be studied and discussed for years to come. He paused, letting that sink in. Use that opportunity wisely. Captain Blackwell cleared his throat. All crew prepare for immediate departure. As the captain returned to the cockpit, an unexpected voice spoke up from several rows back. Mr. Reynolds called Helen Rodriguez, rising slowly from her seat. My husband and I owe you an apology as well. We made the same assumptions Ms. Whitfield did. We didn't speak up when we should have. James stood beside her, nodding solemnly. We have a grandson your age. We would be heartbroken if someone treated him the way you were treated today. I'm ashamed we didn't recognize the injustice immediately. Elijah seemed momentarily surprised by this additional apology, his carefully maintained composure softening slightly. Thank you for that, he said simply. Recognition is the first step toward change. The elderly couple nodded gratefully and returned to their seats, their public acknowledgement creating a ripple effect through the cabin. Several other passengers shifted uncomfortably, confronting their own silent complicity during the incident. As passengers began settling back into their seats, Elijah felt a momentary wave of exhaustion wash over him. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving him acutely aware of how much energy the performance had required. For all his preparation, nothing could have fully readied him for this moment. Patricia ended her live stream with trembling fingers, the final frame capturing Elijah Reynolds as he returned to his seat by the window, the portfolio containing 3 generations of struggle and triumph resting securely on his lap. As the aircraft finally began taxiing toward the runway, Elijah glanced out at the tarmac, momentarily allowing himself to wonder what his father would think of how he had handled the situation. Had he been too harsh, not harsh enough? Would William Reynolds, Jr. have made different choices? The uncertainty stayed with him, even as the plane accelerated down the runway carrying its passengers and the aftershocks of what had transpired toward San Francisco. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Blackwell speaking. We've been cleared for takeoff. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all electronic devices are in airplane mode. The engines of Flight 847 rumbled with increasing intensity as the aircraft aligned with the runway. In Seat 2A, Elijah Reynolds gazed out the window watching the ground crew complete their final checks. The confrontation with Patricia Whitfield had delayed their departure by nearly an hour, but the real work implementing the passenger dignity protocol was just beginning. Throughout the cabin, an unusual atmosphere had settled, something between the reverent quiet of a classroom and the charged energy of a courtroom after a verdict. Passengers who would normally have been engrossed in books or tablets instead stole glances at Elijah and Patricia, witnesses to a moment that had transcended ordinary air travel. Richard Coleman, the financial executive who had supported Patricia's accusations, now found himself isolated. The passengers on either side of him had requested seat changes, leaving conspicuous empty spaces that highlighted his social quarantine. He busied himself with his laptop, pretending not to notice. Daniel Park continued documenting the aftermath on Twitter, his posts now being quoted by major news outlets. Flight 847 finally taking off. Cabin atmosphere completely transformed. Crew treating young CEO with mixture of respect and nervousness. Atlantic Airways, passenger dignity protocol. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, Sofia Alvarez made a split-second decision. She gathered her baby and carry-on bag, then moved to the empty seat beside Patricia. "You mind?" she asked simply. Patricia, surprised, shook her head. "Please, sit." The gesture wasn't lost on the other passengers. A young Hispanic mother choosing to sit beside the woman who had just exposed herself as harboring racial bias was its own kind of statement. Why, Patricia asked quietly as the plane lifted off. "Because isolation doesn't help anyone learn," Sophia replied, adjusting her son on her lap. "And because I've been where you are, not exactly, but close enough." Patricia looked skeptical. 2 years ago, Sophia explained, I posted something online that I thought was harmless. It wasn't. I hurt people without intending to. The internet came for me like it's coming for you now. It was terrifying. What did you do? Eventually, I listened. I learned. I changed. It was painful and humbling and absolutely necessary. She glanced toward Elijah, who was now reviewing documents from his portfolio. That young man just gave you something precious, a structured path forward. Don't waste it. At the front of the cabin, Gabriela Mendez was experiencing her own transformation. The handwritten CCEO addition to her name tag had been intended as a personal reminder of Elijah's unexpected promotion, but it had immediately changed how other crew members interacted with her. Flight attendants who had previously been peers now looked to her for guidance. The co-pilot had asked for her input on an announcement. Ms. Mendez, Captain Blackwell approached once they reached cruising altitude. Mr. Reynolds suggested we discuss implementation of the new protocols. He mentioned you'll be coordinating crew training. The formality in his address, so different from their previous professional interactions, underscored how dramatically her position had changed in a matter of hours. I'm still processing it myself, Captain, she admitted, but I think we start by acknowledging this isn't just about adding new rules. It's about changing the culture of how we verify passenger credentials and handle concerns. Blackwell nodded thoughtfully. 30 years flying, and I've seen countless incidents like today's. Usually handled quietly, passengers rebooked or appeased with upgrades, never addressed at the root. That changes now, Gabriela said with growing confidence. We document everything. We identify patterns. We create accountability at every level. Throughout the cabin, similar conversations were taking place. The college students discussed how the incident would be analyzed in their business ethics class. The elderly couple whispered about how travel etiquette had changed since their youth, reconsidering some of their own assumptions in the process. At 35,000 feet, Flight 847 had become an airborne symposium on bias accountability and corporate transformation. Midway through the flight, Elijah rose from his seat, and walked to the galley where he requested a private word with Gabriella. "How are you handling the promotion?" he asked once they had a moment alone. "Honestly, it's overwhelming," she admitted. "I've been a flight attendant for 8 years. I know service, but executive leadership is different territory." Elijah nodded. "My father believes frontline employees often make the best executives because they actually understand the customer experience. You'll have support. Elena Vasquez, our chief of staff, is already assembling your team. Can I ask you something? Mr. Reynolds?" "Elijah is fine when we're not in public. How are you so calm about all this? If someone had treated me that way, I don't think I could have responded with such composure." For a moment, Elijah's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly. He glanced around to ensure they were truly alone, then leaned closer. "I'm not always this composed," he admitted quietly. "Last week I had a panic attack before a board presentation. Called my sister at Stanford at 3 a.m., convinced I was going to ruin everything my father built." The confession surprised Gabriella, who had witnessed only his confident public persona. "My father started preparing me for moments like this when I was 7 years old." Elijah continued, his voice steadier now. "He'd take me to high-end stores dressed in regular clothes and have me observe how security followed us. We'd go to restaurants and note the different treatment when he arrived in a suit versus jeans." "That sounds difficult for a child," Gabriella observed. "It wasn't about teaching me to expect discrimination," Elijah explained. "It was about preparing me to handle it strategically when it inevitably happened. Your dignity isn't negotiable," he always said, "but how you defend it determines whether you merely survive an incident or transform it." The insight into his upbringing explained much about the poised young executive, but it also revealed something Gabriella hadn't expected: the vulnerability beneath the composure. Before returning to his seat, Elijah added, "Your first official act as CCEO should be to document today's incident as a case study for training, not to humiliate Ms. Whitfield, but to ensure the teaching moment reaches beyond this flight." As Elijah returned to his seat, Patricia watched him with a complex mixture of emotions: shame for her actions, respect for his response, and a growing determination to learn from the experience. Her phone remained off the cascade of messages and notifications temporarily held at bay while she processed what had happened. "It gets better," Sophia said quietly, noticing Patricia's gaze. "Not immediately, not completely, but eventually." "How do you face people afterward?" Patricia asked. "Colleagues, friends, family. Honestly, that's the only way. No excuses, no deflection, just truth and the commitment to do better." Sophia adjusted her sleeping son. "Most people can forgive mistakes. What they can't forgive is the refusal to acknowledge them." Nearby, Anthony Torres sat rigid in his jump seat, still coming to terms with his near-career-ending mistake and unexpected second chance. The responsibility of implementing the protocol in Atlanta, one of the airline's largest hubs, weighed heavily, but also offered an opportunity for professional redemption. When the captain announced their initial descent into San Francisco, a subtle shift occurred throughout the cabin. Passengers began gathering belongings, checking connections, returning to the mundane routines of travel. But something had fundamentally changed. They had witnessed not just an incident, but a response that would ripple throughout an entire industry. As the aircraft touched down at San Francisco International Airport, Captain Blackwell's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. Local time is 1:47 p.m. Before we reach the gate, I want to acknowledge that today's flight has been extraordinary in ways none of us anticipated. Many of you witnessed a situation that will likely be discussed in tomorrow's news. Whatever your perspective on those events, I hope we can agree that treating each passenger with dignity is the foundation of our service. Thank you for flying Atlantic Airways. The simple statement, not scripted by corporate communications but offered spontaneously by a 30-year veteran, signaled how quickly Elijah's message was already taking root. As passengers prepared to deplane Flight 847 had completed 2 journeys, the physical distance from Atlanta to San Francisco, and the more significant distance from complacency to accountability. The moment Flight 847's wheels touched down at San Francisco International Airport, Elena Vasquez's phone buzzed with an urgent message from the PR team. Media presence at arrival gate has tripled in last 30 minutes. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, Bloomberg all sending crews. Local stations already in position. She immediately relayed this to Elijah via text press. Gauntlet awaiting. Options 1. Brief statement. Then Hospital 2. Full press conference at Airport 3. No comment until tomorrow. Recommendation. Option 1. His reply came seconds later. Agreed. Brief statement. Emphasize protocol implementation, not personal incident. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the flight attendants' expressions reflected their awareness of the unusual reception awaiting them. Gabriela Mendez moved efficiently through the cabin, ensuring everything was in order while absorbing the reality that she would step off this plane into a fundamentally different career than the one she had boarded with in Atlanta. Ms. Mendez Elijah called quietly as she passed his row. "When we deplane, stay close to me and Ms. Vasquez. The media will want to speak with you as well." She nodded, the gravity of her new position becoming increasingly apparent. Patricia Whitfield remained in her seat as other passengers gathered their belongings, her expression blank as she contemplated what awaited her beyond the aircraft door. Sofia Alvarez paused beside her baby Mateo, now sleeping against her shoulder. "Delete your social accounts before you leave this plane," Sofia advised quietly. "Not permanently, but long enough to get through the next few days. Trust me on this." Patricia nodded gratefully, pulling out her phone for the first time since landing to quickly deactivate her Instagram and Twitter profiles. When the door finally opened, Elena Vasquez was visible immediately, her professional demeanor a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the waiting media. She boarded briefly, conferring with Captain Blackwell before approaching Elijah. "Mr. Reynolds, we're ready when you are. Security has cleared a path to the conference area." Elijah gathered his portfolio and stood addressing the first-class cabin one final time. "Thank you all for your patience today. What happened on this flight will have lasting impact beyond our individual experiences. I hope each of you will consider your role in creating spaces where dignity is the standard, not the exception." With that, he moved toward the exit, Gabriela falling into step behind him. As they emerged into the terminal, camera flashes erupted and reporters called out questions in a cacophony of overlapping voices. "Mr. Reynolds, can you describe what happened on the flight?" "Ms. Mendez did." "Atlantic Airways staff mishandled the situation." "Is this a publicity stunt for the airline?" "How old are you?" "Mr. Reynolds." Elena expertly guided them to a small podium that had been hastily arranged near the gate. Elijah stepped up to the microphone, his composure unshaken by the media frenzy. "Good afternoon. Today on Atlantic Airways Flight 847, I experienced something that countless travelers face: daily assumptions about where I belong based solely on appearance. What makes my experience different isn't what happened, but the fact that I was in a position to address it immediately and structurally." He outlined the passenger dignity protocol briefly, emphasizing its 3 core components and immediate implementation timeline. His delivery was measured but authoritative, displaying a media savvy remarkable for his age. This isn't about one incident or one individual. It's about recognizing patterns that make travel spaces unwelcoming for too many people and taking concrete steps to change those patterns. As Elijah spoke, other passengers from Flight 847 began to emerge, many immediately approached by reporters seeking first-hand accounts. Daniel Park found himself surrounded by tech journalists who had followed his viral Twitter thread. Sofia Alvarez declined interviews, moving quickly toward her connecting flight with sleeping Mateo. The most dramatic moment came when Patricia Whitfield finally deplaned, eyes downcast, trying to move unnoticed through the terminal. A reporter recognized her immediately, thrusting a microphone toward her face. "Ms. Whitfield, do you have any response to becoming the face of travel discrimination on social media?" She froze momentarily, then straightened her shoulders. "I made a terrible mistake based on biases I didn't want to acknowledge. Now I have an opportunity to learn from it and perhaps help others avoid making the same error. That's all I can say right now." Her dignity in that difficult moment didn't go unnoticed. Several observers nodded approvingly at her taking responsibility rather than becoming defensive. Meanwhile, across multiple news networks, the coverage was rapidly evolving from simple incident reporting to broader analysis on CNN. What we're seeing with the passenger dignity protocol is a remarkable example of how a negative experience can catalyze positive institutional change. The question now is whether other airlines will follow Atlantic Airways' lead. On Fox Business, Atlantic Airways stock is up in after-hours trading, suggesting investors see Reynolds' response as strengthening the brand rather than damaging it. This challenges conventional wisdom about how companies should handle discrimination incidents. On MSNBC, the symbolism here is powerful. A young black executive using his authority not just for personal vindication, but to create structural changes that will benefit countless travelers who don't have his platform or resources. On Bloomberg, the business implications extend beyond airlines. The Reynolds Protocol, as some are already calling it, provides a template for how companies across sectors might address bias in customer service interactions. After completing his brief statement and declining further questions, Elijah was escorted by security through the terminal to a waiting car. Elena and Gabriella accompanied him, already discussing implementation details for the protocol. Hospital first. Elijah instructed the driver. "My father needs to hear about this directly from me before the evening news cycle." As their car pulled away from the terminal, Patricia Whitfield emerged into the San Francisco sunshine, uncertain of her next steps, but committed to the difficult journey ahead. Her phone, temporarily reactivated, showed a text from her employer. "Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m., suspension pending review." She took a deep breath and booked a hotel room for the night. Whatever came next, she would face it without the self-delusion that had brought her to this point. Inside the airport, Anthony Torres was already on a conference call with Atlantic Airways' Atlanta management team, outlining immediate changes to passenger verification procedures. Captain Blackwell and his crew were being debriefed by HR representatives, their observations recorded as valuable input for the developing training program. Flight 847 had landed, but the journey it had initiated was just beginning for the individuals involved for Atlantic Airways, and for an industry being forced to confront its unwritten rules about who belongs in which spaces and why. The private room at San Francisco General Hospital's neurology wing had been converted into a makeshift executive suite. Medical equipment shared space with laptops, tablets, and stacks of corporate reports. At the center of this blend of healthcare and business sat William Reynolds, Jr., his imposing physical presence somewhat diminished by the stroke, but his eyes as sharp and perceptive as ever. When Elijah entered, his father was watching CNN's coverage of the Flight 847 incident, the volume low but audible. William's face broke into a smile that still favored his right side, evidence of the stroke's lingering effects. "There's my CEO," he said, his speech slightly slurred but improving daily with therapy. Elijah crossed the room and embraced his father carefully, mindful of the IV line. Interim operational head, he corrected, setting his portfolio on the bedside table. "How are you feeling?" "Better now. Watched the whole thing live." William gestured toward the television where footage from Patricia's livestream was being analyzed by a panel of commentators. "You handled it exactly right. Didn't lose your cool. Used the moment. Created change." Diana Reynolds, elegant and composed even after hours at her husband's bedside, embraced her son. "We're so proud of you," she said softly. "Though I wish you hadn't had to face that situation alone." "I wasn't alone," Elijah replied. "I had everything you and Dad taught me." William reached for the portfolio Elijah had placed nearby, recognizing it immediately as his father's, the leather-worn soft from decades of handling. "You took Grandpa's journal. I thought I might need his strength today. Turns out I was right." William opened the portfolio, carefully revealing the weathered journal within. William Reynolds Sr. had documented his experiences as a Tuskegee Airman in these pages, along with the early business plans for what would eventually become Atlantic Airways. "Did you show them?" William asked, running his fingers over his father's handwriting. "Yes. The journal was the turning point. When people understood the legacy 3 generations fighting for the right to exist in spaces others said we didn't belong, it changed the conversation." Diana took a seat beside her husband's bed. "The doctor says your father can be discharged next week if his progress continues. The home health care team is already preparing the house." "And the board?" Elijah asked. "Split as expected," William replied. "Montgomery supports you. Lockhart's looking for any excuse to step in. The rest are watching the stock price and waiting to see if you'll make another move as bold as today's." Elijah nodded, unsurprised. Vincent Lockhart had opposed his interim appointment from the beginning, arguing that a 16-year-old lacked the necessary experience and judgment to lead a major corporation, regardless of family connection. "The protocol implementation is already underway," Elijah reported. "Elena's coordinating across departments. I've promoted one of the flight attendants from today's flight to head customer experience, Gabriela Mendez. 8 years with the company handled the situation with remarkable professionalism." William nodded approvingly. "Frontline staff often make the best executives. They actually understand the business from the customer perspective." "That's what I told her." Elijah smiled. "I quoted you directly." The door opened and Zoe Reynolds entered carrying coffee cups for everyone. At 19, Elijah's sister was studying aerospace engineering at Stanford, continuing the family's aviation connection while forging her own path. "My little brother's trending worldwide," she announced, handing him a cup. "Nice work, turning discrimination into corporate policy. Very Reynolds of you." Despite her teasing tone, the pride in her voice was evident. The Reynolds siblings had always been close, united by their unique upbringing as heirs to an aviation legacy and by their shared experiences navigating predominantly white spaces. "How bad is the online reaction?" Diana asked, always practical about managing public perception. "Mixed, but mostly positive," Zoe reported. "The protocol is being praised by civil rights organizations. Conservative outlets are questioning whether Elijah's age makes him qualified to implement such sweeping changes. Business press is focused on the stock. Bump up 9 points in after-hours trading." "And the woman William asked?" "Patricia Whitfield." "Taking a beating online," Elijah admitted. "I offered her a spot in our diversity training program. 6 months paid. Her employer is likely to suspend her pending review." William considered this. "Good. Consequences without destruction. Room for growth." His speech therapist had encouraged shorter sentences to maintain clarity as he recovered. Diana studied her younger child with the perceptive gaze that had made her William's most trusted advisor long before she became his wife. "How are you really doing with all this?" "Elijah? It's one thing to prepare for discrimination in theory. It's another to experience it so publicly." Elijah was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "I'm processing," he finally said. "Part of me is angry that it happened at all. Part of me is satisfied that it created an opportunity for meaningful change." He moved to the window, looking out at the San Francisco skyline as he continued. "Grandpa faced much worse without the platform to address it. Dad built an entire company and still gets questioned about whether he belongs in certain rooms. Compared to that history, what I experienced today was minor. Don't minimize it, William cautioned. Each generation's struggle is valid, different but valid. Zoe joined her brother at the window. The family legacy weighs heavy sometimes, she said quietly. 3 generations of fighting for space, proving excellence, carrying responsibility beyond ourselves. Elijah nodded, understanding completely. I felt Grandpa with me today, he admitted. When I showed his journal, explained who he was, what he fought for, it was like his voice was speaking through me. William's eyes grew misty. He would have been proud. Of both of you. Diana produced a small gift box from her purse. We were going to give you this when your father was discharged, but after today it seems appropriate now. Elijah opened the box to find a vintage gold pocket watch, his grandfather's service timepiece engraved with the Tuskegee Airmen insignia on one side and the family motto on the other, "Excellence has no color." Grandpa carried this through 137 combat missions, William explained. Said, the steady ticking reminded him that progress happens moment by moment, not all at once. Elijah held the watch carefully, feeling the weight of its history. Thank you. I'll carry it with honor. The Reynolds family spent the next hour discussing implementation details of the Passenger Dignity Protocol, with William offering insights from his decades of airline management experience. Despite his medical condition, his strategic thinking remained sharp, identifying potential pitfalls and suggesting refinements to Elijah's plans. As evening approached, a nurse entered to check William's vitals, gently reminding the family that the patient needed rest. Diana and Zoe prepared to leave, but William asked Elijah to stay a moment longer. When they were alone, father and son sat in comfortable silence until William finally spoke. Today was just the beginning, he said carefully, each word deliberate. Some will try to undermine the protocol. Others will resist implementation. Change threatens those who benefit from the status quo. Elijah nodded. I'm prepared for resistance. Remember why we do this? William continued. Not just for ourselves. For everyone who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere because of how they look. He reached for his son's hand, his grip still strong despite the stroke. Your grandfather fought for the right to fly. I built a company where excellence is the only standard that matters. Now you're creating spaces where dignity isn't determined by appearance. 3 generations, Elijah said softly, each changing what we could. The watch William gestured toward the gift isn't just about honoring the past. It's about remembering that time reveals truth. Quick reactions fade. Lasting change endures. As Elijah prepared to leave, allowing his father the rest he needed, William offered one final thought. Tomorrow, the board will question your judgment. The market will evaluate your decision, and the public will debate your methods. But today, you honored our family's highest value, using power to create space for others, not just yourself. With the pocket watch secure in his jacket and his grandfather's portfolio in hand, Elijah left the hospital room carrying 3 generations of struggle, achievement, and wisdom. The Reynolds legacy had always been about more than business success. It was about transforming spaces where others said they didn't belong. The following morning, Elijah faced a reality that few corporate executives ever experienced high school. Despite yesterday's events and his interim CEO role, he was still a junior at Westridge Academy, with calculus homework due and a physics lab to complete. Dude, you're famous. Marcus Diaz, his best friend since 7th grade, exclaimed as Elijah arrived at their usual meeting spot before first period. You're literally trending on every platform. There are memes. Elijah winced. Please tell me they're not bad. Bad. They're epic. CEO energy is the new phrase for shutting down racists. There's one with your face photoshopped onto the rock's body with the caption, can you smell what the CEO is cooking?" Elijah couldn't help but laugh. The absurdity of being simultaneously a viral sensation and a high school student struggling with pre-calculus was not lost on him. Seriously, though, Marcus continued his tone-shifting, "What you did was incredible. My mom cried watching the video. Said she wishes she'd had someone like you around when she was getting harassed for speaking Spanish in first class last year." As they walked to class, Elijah noticed the stares and whispers from other students. Some looked impressed, others intimidated, a few possibly resentful. The social dynamics of high school were complicated enough without adding viral fame to the mix. Mr. Reynolds, his calculus teacher Ms. Patel, said as he entered the classroom, "I believe the homework can wait given yesterday's extracurricular activities." "Thank you, Ms. Patel, but I finished it on the plane," Elijah replied, pulling the completed assignment from his backpack. He had learned from his father that expectations didn't lower because of outside circumstances. If anything, they increased. The juxtaposition between his corporate responsibilities and teenage life created a strange dissonance. In one world, he was making decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of customers. In another, he was worrying about college applications and whether Alicia Martinez in AP English had noticed his new haircut. That afternoon, as he left campus for another hospital visit, Elijah reflected on how few people understood the complexities of his dual existence. The media portrayed him as either a prodigy or a figurehead. His classmates saw him as suddenly famous. Only his family understood the weight he carried, the responsibility to honor his grandfather's courage, extend his father's vision, and forge his own path forward. It was a unique burden, but also a unique privilege. And yesterday's events had reminded him of exactly why that burden mattered. 2 weeks after the Flight 847 incident, Elijah Reynolds stood at the head of Atlantic Airways' main conference room, facing the executive leadership team and several board members. The passenger dignity protocol implementation was facing its first serious challenge. "The training costs alone will exceed $2 million in the first quarter," stated Vincent Lockhart, the board's most vocal critic of the initiative. The silver-haired investment banker tapped his pen against the financial projections displayed on the screen. "Add technology development reporting systems and audit partnerships, and we're looking at nearly $12 million this fiscal year. All for a protocol developed on the fly during a personal incident." Elijah had anticipated this resistance. Vincent had opposed his interim appointment from the beginning, arguing that a 16-year-old lacked the necessary judgment to lead a major corporation regardless of family connection. "The protocol wasn't developed on the fly, Mr. Lockhart," Elijah replied calmly. "It formalizes principles my father has advocated throughout his leadership. The incident simply provided the catalyst for implementation." Elena Vasquez smoothly advanced the presentation to the next slide. "Our financial projections account for these costs. Moreover, they're offset by several factors." She highlighted key metrics. Positive media coverage has generated an estimated $8.7 million in earned media value. Customer sentiment has improved 22% across all channels. Employee morale in customer-facing roles is up 17% according to our Pulse surveys. Robert Chen, the CFO, added, "The stock has maintained its 7% gain since the announcement. The market clearly doesn't see this as a financial liability." Lockhart remained unconvinced. The market responds to novelty. What happens when implementation problems emerge? When passengers abuse the reporting system to get upgrades or compensation? When staff feel hamstrung by excessive oversight? These were legitimate concerns that deserved serious consideration. Elijah gestured to Anthony Torres, who had flown in from Atlanta for this meeting. "Mr. Torres has been leading our pilot implementation. He can speak to the operational challenges directly." Anthony stood, his demeanor transformed from the nervous ground supervisor of 2 weeks ago. Leading the protocol implementation had given him renewed purpose. We've identified several implementation challenges he acknowledged frankly. First, defining what constitutes appearance-based discrimination versus legitimate verification concerns. Second, preventing misuse of the reporting system. Third, ensuring consistent application across all hubs and partner airlines. He advanced to his own slides, displaying a decision tree flowchart. We've developed this verification framework to guide staff through passenger interactions. It's designed to maintain security protocols while eliminating unnecessary profiling. The flowchart showed a sophisticated approach to passenger verification that focused on documentation and behavior rather than appearance or assumptions. It included specific language for addressing concerns, clear escalation paths, and accountability checkpoints. We're also implementing tiered verification, Anthony continued. Routine checks for everyone with escalation requiring supervisor approval and documentation. This creates both consistency and accountability. Gabriela Mendez, now fully installed as Chief Customer Experience Officer, addressed the reporting system concerns. We've designed the passenger feedback mechanism with anti-abuse safeguards. Reports are cross-referenced with flight data passenger history and staff accounts to identify pattern reporting or fraudulent claims. Despite these thorough responses, Vincent Lockhart persisted. These all sound like reasonable precautions on paper. But you're fundamentally changing how our staff interact with passengers based on one incident involving the interim CEO. That's not sound business practice. The room tensed at the implied criticism. Elijah remained composed, but Elena's expression hardened slightly. Mr. Lockhart, Elijah said, you're framing this as a response to one incident involving me personally. That fundamentally mischaracterizes the situation. He opened his tablet and displayed internal data that had been compiled since the protocol announcement. In the 2 weeks since we announced these changes, we've received 847 unsolicited passenger communications sharing similar experiences on our airline. Of those, 76% involved passengers of color being questioned about their seating assignments primarily in premium cabins. The numbers hung in the air, impossible to dismiss as anecdotal. This isn't about one incident, Elijah continued. It's about a pattern that was invisible to some of us, but painfully familiar to others. The protocol doesn't create a new standard, it ensures we consistently meet the standard we already claim to have. Chairwoman Janet Montgomery, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. Vincent, I understand your fiscal concerns. They're valid and should inform our implementation approach. But opposing the protocol itself suggests you believe these reported experiences aren't significant enough to address structurally. Is that your position? It was a masterful intervention, acknowledging the legitimate aspects of his concerns while exposing the problematic underlying assumption. Lockhart, recognizing the trap, adjusted his stance. Of course we should address discrimination. I'm simply advocating for a measured, data-driven approach rather than a reactive one. The data is what we're showing you. Elijah countered, gesturing to the screen. And our approach has been measured comprehensive without being disruptive to our core operations. The meeting continued for another hour, addressing specific implementation challenges across different departments. Human Resources reported difficulties incorporating the new training into already scheduled staff development programs. IT described technical challenges integrating the reporting system with existing customer service platforms. Legal raised concerns about potential liability if the protocol created different standards for different passengers. Each issue was legitimate, but none was insurmountable. For each challenge raised, Elijah and his team presented thoughtful solutions that balanced ideal implementation with practical constraints. As the meeting concluded, Chairwoman Montgomery summarized the board's position. The Passenger Dignity Protocol will proceed as planned with quarterly reviews of implementation costs and effectiveness metrics. Mr. Lockhart will work with the finance team to optimize resource allocation without compromising the core principles. It was a diplomatic compromise that maintained the initiative while acknowledging the fiscal oversight responsibility of the board. As executives filed out of the conference room, Vincent Lockhart approached Elijah privately. "You handled that well," he admitted grudgingly. "Your father would have been similarly stubborn." "I prefer to call it principled," Elijah replied with a slight smile. "Perhaps. But principles don't always align with shareholder interests." "That depends on your time frame, Mr. Lockhart. Short-term profit maximization and long-term value creation often require different approaches." The older man studied him for a moment. "You sound remarkably like your father for someone so young." "I'll take that as a compliment." "It was intended as one despite our disagreements." Lockhart gathered his papers. "I still think 16 is too young to run an airline, but I'm beginning to understand why your father believes otherwise." As Lockhart departed, Elena approached with updates from the implementation teams. "Technical development is on schedule. The reporting system beta test launches next week in 3 hub airports. Training modules are complete for flight crews with gate agent and customer service versions in final review." Elijah nodded, making notes on his tablet. And the resistance Elena didn't pretend to misunderstand. About 30% of mid-level management is dragging their feet. Not open opposition, but passive delays, concerns about additional workload claims that existing procedures are sufficient. Expected. How are we addressing it? Combination of accountability metrics tied to performance reviews and success stories from early implementers. The Atlanta team is becoming our model. Their complaint rates are already down 14% just from the procedural changes. Anthony Torres had indeed transformed his near-career-ending mistake into a leadership opportunity, becoming the protocol's most effective advocate among operational staff. And Patricia Whitfield, Elijah asked, completed her first month of training. Her instructor reports genuine engagement and progress. Her employer placed her on 3 months probation rather than termination, partly due to our recommendation. What Elena didn't mention, what neither she nor Elijah yet knew, was that Patricia's journey through the diversity training program was far more complicated than the instructor's official reports suggested. In a downtown San Francisco hotel conference room, Patricia sat across from her diversity training counselor, Dr. Lydia Fernandez, her frustration evident. "I don't understand why we keep coming back to this," Patricia said, gesturing at the case study materials. "I've already acknowledged my bias. I apologized publicly. What more am I supposed to do?" Dr. Fernandez regarded her calmly. "Acknowledgement is the first step, not the final one. We're working to identify the root causes and develop new behavioral patterns. But these exercises feel like punishment, not learning," Patricia insisted, "making me role-play being denied service over and over. How is that helping me grow?" The counselor set down her pen. "Ms. Whitfield, I understand this is uncomfortable, but discomfort is often where growth happens. You spent decades developing certain thought patterns. They won't change overnight, and they won't change without emotional engagement." Patricia stared out the window, fighting back tears of frustration. The training program wasn't what she'd expected. She'd anticipated corporate-style diversity seminars, PowerPoint presentations on unconscious bias, group discussions about inclusive language. Instead, she was facing intensive personal work that forced her to confront deeply held beliefs she hadn't even recognized. Yesterday's session had been particularly difficult. Dr. Fernandez had asked her to write a letter to Elijah from the perspective of someone who had experienced discrimination their entire life. The exercise had left Patricia sobbing in her hotel room, overwhelmed by the empathy it required. "I'm trying," she said quietly, "but sometimes I feel like I'm losing myself in this process." "You're not losing yourself," Dr. Fernandez replied gently. "You're finding parts of yourself you've never had to examine before. It's supposed to be difficult." Patricia nodded slowly. Despite the challenges, she was beginning to recognize the value in this painful journey. Each revelation about her own biases, where they came from, how they operated, the harm they caused, was a step toward becoming the person she had always believed herself to be. The dual journeys of Elijah and Patricia, one implementing structural change across an entire corporation, the other undertaking the difficult work of personal transformation, represented two essential aspects of addressing discrimination. Systems needed to change, but so did the individuals within them. Elijah's passenger dignity protocol was changing Atlantic Airways from the top down. Patricia's training was changing one person from the inside out. Both approaches were necessary, neither sufficient alone. As Elijah considered the implementation challenges facing the protocol, he touched the pocket watch he now carried daily. His grandfather's timepiece, a reminder that progress came through persistence despite resistance. The passenger dignity protocol faced legitimate implementation challenges and organizational resistance. Some were practical concerns requiring tactical solutions. Others were manifestations of deeper reluctance to change established patterns. Addressing both dimensions would require continued vigilance, strategic thinking, and the quiet determination that had characterized 3 generations of Reynolds leadership. The journey from confrontation on Flight 847 to institutional transformation was proving to be exactly what William Reynolds, Jr. had predicted during their hospital conversation, the beginning, not the end, of the real work. The grand ballroom of the San Francisco Hilton buzzed with anticipation as transportation industry leaders, civil rights advocates, and media representatives gathered for the official launch of the Reynolds Foundation for Transportation Equity. At exactly 7:00 p.m., Elijah Reynolds approached the podium dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that balanced his youth with appropriate gravitas. 3 months ago, I experienced something that countless travelers face every day: assumptions about where I belong based solely on appearance. What made my experience different wasn't what happened, but the position I was in to address it systematically. The audience familiar with the now famous Flight 847 incident listened attentively as Elijah outlined what had transpired since that pivotal day. The passenger dignity protocol has now been fully implemented across all Atlantic Airways operations. In these first 90 days, we've documented significant progress toward our goal of ensuring all passengers are treated with equal respect regardless of appearance. Behind him, slides displayed key metrics. Discrimination complaints down 47% system-wide. Customer satisfaction scores up 18% among minority passengers. Employee engagement improved 23% in customer-facing roles. But numbers only tell part of the story, Elijah continued. The real measure of our progress lies in the experiences of our passengers and the culture shift within our organization. He invited Gabriela Mendez to join him at the podium. Now fully established as Chief Customer Experience Officer, she had traded her flight attendant uniform for executive attire, though she still wore her original Atlantic Airways wings pinned to her lapel as a reminder of her frontline origins. Before the protocol, we handled discriminatory incidents individually, addressing symptoms rather than causes, Gabriela explained to the audience. Now we track patterns, identify problem areas, and implement targeted interventions. More importantly, we've changed the fundamental question from, "Does this person belong here?" to, "How do we ensure everyone feels welcome?" Atlantic Airways had become a case study in corporate transformation, with business schools already incorporating the protocol implementation into their curriculum. The Harvard Business Review had featured it as their cover story, From Incident to Institution: How Atlantic Airways Transformed Customer Service Standards. The most significant development was announced next as Elijah revealed the Foundation's first major initiative. Today, we're launching the Transportation Equity Scholarship Program, providing full funding for 50 students from underrepresented backgrounds to pursue careers in aviation, from pilots and mechanics to executives and designers. The first cohort of scholarship recipients stood as their names were called, representing the diversity that the transportation industry had historically lacked. Their presence embodied the Foundation's mission changing not just how passengers were treated, but who shaped the industry itself. Across the ballroom, familiar faces from Flight 847 were visible among the attendees. Anthony Torres, now Atlantic Airways Vice President for Operational Standards, sat with his family, his career not just saved but elevated through his dedicated implementation of the protocol. Daniel Park, whose Twitter documentation had helped the incident go viral, had been invited as a technology consultant for the Foundation's digital initiatives. Even Patricia Whitfield was present, though keeping a low profile toward the back of the room. Her journey over the past 3 months had been challenging but transformative. After completing Atlantic Airways' diversity training program, she had surprisingly declined to return to her marketing position, instead accepting a role with a consulting firm specializing in corporate inclusion strategies. When approached by a reporter earlier in the evening, Patricia had offered a thoughtful perspective. "I'm not here as a success story. I'm here as someone still learning, still growing, still working to align my actions with my values. What happened on that flight forced me to confront biases I didn't want to acknowledge. That process doesn't end after a few months of training." What the reporter couldn't know was how difficult Patricia's journey had been. 6 weeks into her training, she had nearly quit after a particularly challenging session left her feeling hopeless about her ability to change. The turning point had come during a facilitated conversation with a group of frequent travelers who had experienced discrimination similar to what she had inflicted on Elijah. Hearing their stories not in the abstract, but from real people sitting across from her, had finally broken through her remaining defenses. The most poignant moment in her training had come when she was asked to role-play an interaction not as the perpetrator of discrimination, but as its target. The exercise had left her shaking, providing a glimpse, just a glimpse of the emotional toll that daily microaggressions exact from those who experience them regularly. That night, she had written a letter to her younger self detailing all the unexamined assumptions she had carried for decades. William Reynolds, Jr. watched his son from the front row, his physical recovery progressing well enough that he had resumed limited duties as CEO, working in partnership with Elijah during the transition period. The stroke had affected his mobility, requiring a cane, but his mind remained sharp and his strategic vision unchanged. After the formal presentation, William joined Elijah on stage for the ceremonial signing of partnership agreements with major transportation companies, committing to adopt versions of the Passenger Dignity Protocol. Delta, American, United, and 6 international carriers had already implemented similar standards, creating a ripple effect throughout the industry. "My father taught me that true leadership isn't about wielding power," Elijah told the audience as the signing concluded. "It's about using your position to create spaces where others can thrive with dignity." The protocol isn't just about preventing discrimination. It's about establishing a new standard where inclusion is the default, not the exception. As the formal program transitioned to networking, Elijah circulated among the attendees, handling the responsibilities of host with remarkable poise for someone not yet 17. He paused when he reached Patricia Whitfield, their first face-to-face meeting since Flight 847. "Ms. Whitfield." He greeted her with professional courtesy. "Thank you for coming tonight." "Thank you for the invitation," she replied. "Not everyone would have extended it given our history. That history now includes your work with the Diversity Initiative and your new role in consulting. The full story matters, not just the difficult beginning." Patricia nodded, appreciating the perspective. "Your foundation is doing important work, the scholarship program particularly. We're just getting started," Elijah assured her. The protocol addressed how passengers are treated once they're on board. The Foundation's work focuses on who gets opportunities to enter the industry in the first place. As they conversed, photographers captured the moment, not for sensationalism, but as visual evidence of the reconciliation and growth that had emerged from Confrontation. Tomorrow's business pages would feature the image alongside stories of the Foundation, launch a powerful illustration of accountability and transformation. Later that evening, as the event concluded, William and Elijah Reynolds stood together near the ballroom windows overlooking San Francisco Bay. "Your grandfather would have been proud," William said, his voice stronger than it had been in the hospital, but still carrying the subtle markers of his stroke recovery. He never got to see the impact of his work fully realized. "I carry his watch to remember that progress takes time," Elijah replied, touching the pocket where the timepiece rested. "But sometimes transformation happens in unexpected moments, like when someone tells you that you don't belong in first class," William observed with a slight smile. Exactly like that. The Reynolds Foundation for Transportation Equity represented more than just corporate social responsibility. It embodied a family legacy 3 generations in the making, from a Tuskegee airman fighting for the right to fly to an entrepreneur building an airline, against industry skepticism to a teenage executive ensuring that dignity wasn't determined by appearance. As father and son departed the event, they passed a wall displaying the Foundation's mission statement inscribed beneath a photo of William Reynolds Sr. in his Tuskegee Airman uniform. "Excellence has no color. Dignity has no dress code. Respect has no price point. We advance transportation equity one journey at a time." The words captured not just a corporate initiative, but a family philosophy that had transformed an industry. On the first anniversary of the Flight 847 incident, Atlantic Airways hosted a transportation equity summit that brought together executives from 6 continents, civil rights leaders, and policy experts. The event, held at the company's newly constructed Reynolds Center for Inclusive Leadership, showcased the remarkable industry transformation that had occurred in just 12 months. Elijah Reynolds, now officially appointed as co-CEO alongside his fully recovered father, delivered the keynote address to a packed auditorium. 1 year ago today, a confrontation that could have remained a personal grievance instead became the catalyst for industry-wide change he began. The Passenger Dignity Protocol has now been adopted by 47 airlines serving over 800 million passengers annually. What started as one company's response to discrimination has evolved into a global standard for equitable treatment in transportation. The statistics projected behind him told a compelling story. Customer discrimination complaints down 62% across participating airlines. Employee satisfaction up 24%. Diversity in new aviation career applications increased 37%. Most significantly, the Transportation Equity Scholarship Program had expanded from its initial 50 students to over 200, with partner companies committing to guaranteed interviews upon graduation. But perhaps the most meaningful impact Elijah continued can be seen in the cultural shift within our organizations. What was once dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstandings is now recognized as a structural challenge requiring structural solutions. In the front row sat the complete Flight 847 crew, Captain Blackwell, Gabriela Mendez, and the flight attendants who had witnessed the confrontation. Behind them, many passengers from that flight had accepted invitations to attend, including Sofia Alvarez, who now served on the Foundation's Community Advisory Board, and Daniel Park, whose technology firm had developed the protocol's reporting application. Patricia Whitfield was also present, though in a different capacity than anyone might have predicted a year earlier. After completing her diversity training and consultation work, she had made the surprising decision to join the Reynolds Foundation as Director of Corporate Transformation, leveraging her marketing background to help companies implement equity initiatives effectively. "My journey from being the problem to helping solve it hasn't been linear or easy," she shared during a panel discussion later that day. "It required confronting uncomfortable truths about myself and the unexamined biases that influenced my behavior. What I've learned is that transformation happens at the intersection of accountability and opportunity." Her candor about her experience had made her an unexpectedly effective advocate, particularly with corporate executives resistant to change. Those who might dismiss criticism from traditional diversity consultants often found Patricia's perspective more difficult to ignore, precisely because she had once shared their blind spots. The summit's afternoon session featured the graduation ceremony for the first cohort of Transportation Equity Scholars. 27 pilots, 15 aircraft mechanics, 8 air traffic controllers, and 10 management trainees received their certifications ready to enter an industry that had systematically excluded people who looked like them for generations. William Reynolds, Jr., now fully recovered from his stroke, joined his son on stage for this portion of the program. Together, they presented each graduate with a replica of William Reynolds Sr.'s Tuskegee Airman wings, symbolizing the continuation of his legacy. "My father fought for the right to fly when America said black men didn't belong in cockpits," William told the graduates. "Today, you enter an industry that still has far to go, but that now acknowledges its responsibility to ensure everyone can pursue excellence without artificial barriers." The day concluded with the unveiling of a permanent installation in the Reynolds Center lobby, a glass wall etched with thousands of passenger stories collected through the protocol's reporting system. Anonymous but powerful, these testimonials documented both discrimination experienced and positive changes observed since implementation. At the center of the wall, a single quote stood out in larger text words from William Reynolds Sr.'s journal, written after his return from World War II. "They let me defend the skies, but questioned my right to sit in certain seats. Progress isn't just about access to the cockpit, but about dignity in every part of the journey." As attendees departed the summit, they received a small replica of the antique pocket watch. Elijah carried a reminder that transformation happens moment by moment through persistence and purpose. The passenger dignity protocol had evolved beyond its origins as a response to a single incident. It had become a framework for examining how assumptions shape experiences, how power can be used to create more equitable systems, and how dignity should never depend on appearance, attire, or assumptions. What had begun with 5 words, "You don't belong here, boy," had transformed into a movement, ensuring that such words would be challenged not just through individual courage, but through institutional commitment to a higher standard. 3 generations of struggle, achievement, and wisdom converged in the quiet moment as Elijah Reynolds stood alone in his office after the summit concluded. Outside, attendees were departing with renewed commitment to transportation equity. Inside, the young executive reflected on the unexpected journey that had unfolded from a single confrontation on Flight 847. On his desk sat 3 objects that embodied this journey: his grandfather's Tuskegee Airman journal, now preserved in a climate-controlled display case, but opened to a page where William Reynolds Sr. had written, "Dignity is not given. It is claimed." Beside it rested the antique pocket watch that had timed 3 generations of progress, and newly added a framed letter from a retired Tuskegee Airman who had served alongside his grandfather. "Young man," the letter read, "your grandfather would be proud. He fought for the right to fly. You've ensured future generations will fly with dignity. Well done." The letter now occupied a place of honor beside the family photographs and corporate awards. For Elijah, it represented the most meaningful validation of his work recognition that the protocol wasn't just corporate policy, but the continuation of a legacy that extended far beyond Atlantic Airways. As he prepared to leave for the evening, Elijah's phone buzzed with a notification from the protocol's reporting system. Not a complaint this time, but a message of gratitude from a passenger who had experienced respectful treatment in a situation where they had previously faced suspicion. "Today marked the first time I traveled without being asked to verify my first-class ticket. 3 separate times," the message read. "Small change. Big difference. Thank you." Such messages arrived daily now, each one confirming that real change doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures or headlines. Sometimes transformation is measured in the absence of humiliations that no longer occur in the quiet dignity of journeys completed without unnecessary challenges. Elijah slipped his grandfather's watch into his pocket. a tactile reminder that progress happens one moment at a time, and that the most enduring changes often begin with the courage to stand firm when someone says, "You don't belong here." This story reminds us that dignity isn't a luxury, it's a right that belongs to everyone regardless of appearance. If you've ever experienced discrimination or witnessed it happening to others, remember that your voice matters. Together, we can create spaces where everyone is treated with respect. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this powerful message of transformation and accountability. Your engagement helps us bring more stories of courage and positive change to light. What experiences have you had with discrimination in travel or public spaces? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger. It's the calm certainty that you belong exactly where you are.